Before you go any further, if you've ever felt like you were too much, too loud, too different, too real for the world you walked into, this story was written for you. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, follow the channel, and don't you dare leave before the ending. Because what happens in that kitchen will change the way you think about strength, beauty, and what it means to be exactly enough. Now, let's begin.
Baci onti.
The night Kong Ji-hoon's wife was buried, it rained so hard the flowers on her casket turned to pulp before the last guest left the cemetery. He stood at the grave long after everyone else had gone, his security detail hanging back at a respectful distance, their black umbrellas barely visible through the downpour. And he felt nothing. Not grief, not rage, not the particular hollow ache that people described in the movies he'd stopped watching years ago. Just a cold, clinical awareness that the machinery of his life had lost one of its components, that something functional had been removed, that the absence would require adjustment. He told himself that was what he felt because the alternative was something he couldn't afford. The drive back to the mansion on the hill above the Han River took 40 minutes in the rain. Ji-hoon sat in the rear seat of the armored black SUV and watched Seoul blur past the tinted window, the neon signs smearing into streaks of red and gold, and thought about quarterly projections, about the shipment coming through Busan, about the lieutenant who'd been skimming off the Western accounts and what needed to happen to him before the week was out, about everything except the woman they'd just put in the ground. He was 34 years old. He had built an empire on the bones of men who'd underestimated him. He had outlasted rivals twice his age, survived 3 assassination attempts, and bent half of Seoul's political establishment to his will through a combination of money, information, and the kind of quiet menace that didn't require raised voices. He had done all of this, and none of it had prepared him for the moment. He walked into his son's bedroom that night and found Min-jun sitting in the center of his bed, still in his funeral clothes, holding a photograph of his mother with both hands. The boy didn't look up. Ji-hoon stood in the doorway for a long time, watching his son's back, waiting for something. Some instinct to activate, some paternal reflex that would tell him what to do or say. Nothing came. The rain hammered the window. The security light in the courtyard below threw long shadows across the ceiling. Min-jun held the photograph and didn't make a sound. Ji-hoon pulled the door shut and walked back down the hallway to his study. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey, sat behind his desk, and opened his laptop. That was 2 years ago. Boom. Min-jun hadn't spoken since the night of the funeral. Not a word. Not to his father, not to the rotating cast of nannies who'd come and gone through the mansion's service entrance like a tide of failed applicants. Not to the child psychologist Ji-hoon paid 20 million won a month to sit across from the boy twice a week and generate reports that said the same thing in different arrangements of clinical language. Trauma response, elective mutism. Requires patient and consistent emotional environment. Prognosis, uncertain. Uncertain. Ji-hoon had read that word so many times that it stopped meaning anything. The nannies were the real problem. He'd gone through 11 of them in 24 months, which was a rate of attrition that would have concerned him in any other operational context. The first 3 had quit within a week each, citing the oppressive atmosphere of the estate. The 4th had been removed after he'd discovered she was feeding information about household schedules to a tabloid. The 5th through 8th had been progressively more qualified on paper and progressively more useless in practice. Women who knew all the right developmental psychology terminology and couldn't get a traumatized 5-year-old to make eye contact. The 9th had burst into tears during her 2nd week and confessed she found the mansion spiritually suffocating, which Ji-hoon found irritating in a way he couldn't fully articulate. The 10th had lasted 6 weeks before developing what the agency diplomatically described as irreconcilable differences with the security protocols. The 11th had simply stopped showing up one Monday without explanation or communication. Yoon Seo-ah thought the whole enterprise was beneath Ji-hoon's dignity. "You're wasting time," she'd told him last week, stretched across the sitting room sofa in a way that was calculated to look effortless. Seo-ah did everything in ways calculated to look effortless. It was, Ji-hoon had come to understand, her primary mode of existence, the constant performance of ease by someone who worked very hard at appearing not to work hard. Min-jun needs consistency, routine. Not a new stranger every few months. Bring him to the resort in Jeju, give him space, let him adjust on his own timeline. He's 7 years old. Children are more resilient than we give them credit for. Ji-hoon had looked at her across the sitting room and thought, "You have never once in your life had to be resilient." He didn't say it. There was a version of his relationship with Seo-ah that required him to maintain certain diplomatic courtesies, and he maintained them because the alternative, the conversation about what their arrangement actually was and wasn't, was one he didn't have the bandwidth for right now. What he said instead was, "There's another candidate Thursday." Seo-ah had smiled the way she always smiled when she'd already decided something. "I'll be here." Oktat. The agency sent a file 2 days before the interview. Ji-hoon read it in his car on the way back from a meeting in Gangnam that had gone the way meetings with city councilmen usually went, with envelopes exchanged over plates of food nobody actually ate, and agreements made in the language of things left unsaid. He read it with the same attention he gave to any intelligence document, systematically, dispassionately, looking for inconsistencies. Amara Brooks, 29, American, Chicago-born, certified in early childhood development, specialized training in speech delay and trauma-informed care, 3 years working in a pediatric developmental clinic on Chicago's South Side. 1 year in Seoul through an international child care exchange program that placed foreign-trained child care workers with Korean families. No criminal record, no social media presence beyond a locked personal account. References described her as extraordinarily patient, naturally intuitive with children, and occasionally accident-prone in ways that become endearing after the third incident. That last line had been added by the agency coordinator in parentheses, which Ji-hoon noted as unusual. The photograph in the file was a professional headshot, the kind taken against a neutral background with a careful smile. She was black, full-faced, with natural hair pulled back and eyes that were paying attention to something behind the camera that nobody else could see. She looked, Ji-hoon thought, like someone who had made a decision before they walked into the room and was quietly committed to it. He set the file aside and watched Seoul pass outside the window. Minjun had shown no reaction to any of the previous 11 candidates during their introductions. He'd sat in his chair in the playroom with his hands folded, looking at the floor, and had not acknowledged a single one of them. The psychologist said this was consistent with his condition and should not be taken as a predictive indicator. Ji-hoon had taken it anyway. He was a man who had built an empire on his ability to read situations correctly, and what he read in that playroom, over 11 introductions, was a child who had decided the world of adults was not to be trusted and was waiting very patiently to be proven wrong. He didn't know if Amara Brooks was the one who'd prove it. He gave it better odds than he'd given the last 11. She arrived 40 minutes early. Ji-hoon wasn't told this immediately. He was on a call with his attorney about a land acquisition that was becoming complicated in predictable ways, but the security feed showed it. She came up the hill in a taxi, paid the driver, and stood at the bottom of the estate's front steps for a full 2 minutes before pressing the intercom. Not hesitating, exactly, more like composing herself, like someone running through a checklist in her head, making sure everything was in order before she knocked. She was carrying a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and a portfolio under her arm. The portfolio, Ji-hoon could see from the camera angle, had a corner that was held together with masking tape. It had clearly been repaired at least twice. Park Sung-jin, Ji-hoon's head of household security, met her at the door and escorted her to the receiving room to wait. Ji-hoon watched on the feed as she walked through the entrance hall. The 50 meters of Italian marble, the art on the walls that cost more than most people's houses, the security cameras visible and invisible, the weight of the place pressing down on everything that walked through it. She looked up at the ceiling once, took a breath, kept walking. He finished the call, closed the laptop, and went downstairs. He heard it before he reached the bottom of the stairs. A crash. Then a cascade of smaller impacts, the sound of things scattering across a hard floor. Then a voice, American accent, pitched low and mortified. "Oh, oh no, oh, I'm so sorry, He came around the corner of the hallway into the entry of the receiving room and stopped. Amara Brooks was on her knees in the center of the marble floor, attempting to gather the contents of her portfolio, which had apparently launched itself from under her arm and distributed itself across approximately 4 square meters of pristine Italian marble. Crayon drawings, dozens of them, clearly made by children, lay scattered everywhere. A canvas pouch of crayons had burst open, sending roughly 60 individual crayons rolling across the floor in every direction. And there was coffee. A large iced coffee, which had apparently been balanced on top of the portfolio, had detonated across the floor in a wide radius, its ice cubes sliding under furniture, its contents spreading toward the legs of a console table that held a 19th century celadon vase worth more money than the taxi that had brought her up the hill. Amara was scrambling after everything simultaneously, trying to gather the drawings, catch the crayons, assess the coffee damage, all at once, which meant she was accomplishing none of it effectively. There was coffee on her blazer. There was a crayon under her left knee. She was still apologizing to the room at large. Standing near the window, watching with an expression that belonged in a museum of contempt, was Yoon Seo-ah. Ji-hoon had not been informed Seo-ah had arrived early. "Security," Seo-ah said, without raising her voice, which was somehow worse than if she had. "Please remove this woman." The 2 guards in the room looked at Ji-hoon. Amara froze. She looked up for the first time since the crash, first at Seo-ah, then at the guards, and finally at Ji-hoon. And in the 3 seconds of that look, Ji-hoon registered several things. She was embarrassed, badly so, the kind of embarrassment that went all the way down. She was assessing whether to start crying, had decided not to, and was now working out whether to fight or fold. Her jaw was set. Her hands were still full of scattered crayon drawings. There was an ice cube melting slowly near her right shoe. She looked, despite everything, like someone who had not yet decided she'd lost. "I'm so sorry," she said again, and her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "I know this is... I'll clean it up. I brought extra copies of everything. This isn't... I just need a minute." "You need to leave," Seo-ah said. "So-ah." Ji-hoon's voice came out flat. She looked at him. He didn't look back. His eyes were on the floor, specifically on a small figure that had appeared in the hallway doorway. Min-jun, in his gray sweater and dark pants, standing very still in the way he always stood, like he was trying to take up as little space as possible, like he'd learned somewhere that the safest posture was one that invited the least attention. He was 7 years old, and he moved through the world like a child who was perpetually bracing for something. His eyes were on the floor, too, specifically on one orange crayon that had rolled to a stop approximately 18 inches from his feet. The room had gone very quiet. Amara was still on her knees, papers in her hands, watching the boy. She didn't say anything. She didn't make a move toward him or try to bridge the distance with a cheerful adult introduction. She just watched, the way you watch something that might be about to do something unexpected, and waited. Min-jun took 2 careful steps into the room and bent down and picked up the orange crayon. He held it in both hands, looked at it. His thumb moved across the paper label. Amara said quietly, without performing any warmth at all, "That's a good one. Orange is tricky. Most people skip it, but it's the only color that gets the inside of a sunset right." Min-jun looked at the crayon. Then he looked at her. Ji-hoon watched his son's face and felt something move in his chest that he didn't have vocabulary for. Something that had been still for 2 years shifting without warning, like ice giving way in early spring. The corner of Min-jun's mouth moved. Not a full smile. Not yet. But something. The beginning of one. The possibility of one. The first indication in 700 and some days that his son's face still knew what a smile was. Ji-hoon looked at Seo-ah. She was watching the boy with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing. "She stays," Ji-hoon said. "Ji-hoon?" "She stays." He finally looked at Seo-ah directly. "You don't." The room held the silence for a long moment. Then Seo-ah gathered her coat from the chair with precise, controlled movements and walked out of the mansion without another word, and the click of her heels on the marble receded down the hallway and vanished through the front door. Ji-hoon crossed the room, stepped around the scattered drawings and the coffee and the small scattered army of crayons and crouched down to where Amara was still kneeling. He picked up 3 of the drawings from the floor near his feet, held them out to her. She took them. "I'm genuinely sorry about... Can you start Monday?" She blinked at him. "The mess," he said. "Park will handle it. Can you start Monday?" Amara looked at the drawings in her hands. She looked at Min Jun, who was still holding the orange crayon, his small hands wrapped around it like it was something that mattered. She took a breath. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, I can start Monday." Monday came with the kind of early autumn weather that Seoul did better than almost any other city. Clear and cool, the Han River visible from the upper floors of the mansion like a ribbon of hammered silver. And Amara arrived with 3 suitcases, one overloaded backpack, and a box of art supplies that she had clearly organized at some earlier point, and then reorganized and then abandoned the second organization in favor of just getting them into a box. Park Sung-jin showed her to the room on the east wing that Ji-hoon had designated for her, larger than what she'd had in the apartment share near Hongdae, furnished in the spare, expensive way everything in the mansion was furnished, and watched her put the suitcases down and stand in the middle of the room and look around at it. "Is there anything specific you need?" he asked. "Yeah," Amar said. She was still looking around the room. "Is there a lock on the outside of Minjun's door? Like a bolt or something?" Park Sung-jin blinked. "No." "Good. Children don't need locked doors, just wanted to confirm." She paused. "Also, and this is not a challenge, I'm genuinely asking, what's the protocol if I want to take Min-jun outside the estate, like a park or somewhere?" Park Sung-jin explained the protocol, which was extensive. It involved advance notice of at least 24 hours, a security assessment of the proposed location, minimum 2 plainclothes agents, route variation, and a communication check every 30 minutes. Amara listened to all of this with her arms crossed and a look of focused concentration that reminded Park, obscurely, of the general during mission briefings. "Okay," she said when he finished. "That's a lot, but okay. We'll work with it." Park Sung-jin, who had worked for Kang Ji-hoon for 9 years and had seen a great many things, found himself thinking, this one is going to last. He kept the thought to himself and showed her where the kitchen was. The kitchen, as it turned out, was where Amara's relationship with the mansion began to develop its particular character. She found it the first morning at 5:45. She was a pre-dawn person, had been since her clinic days when the early shift was the only way to get quiet time before the day started its assault. Padding through the dark hallways in socks and an oversized sweatshirt with Chicago written across it in cracked letters. She found the kitchen, which was the size of a professional restaurant kitchen and approximately as intimidating, and she stood in the doorway for a moment taking it in. And then she went in and found the coffee and started making breakfast. The first alarm she set off was at 6:12. She hadn't known that the walk-in refrigerator door, when left open for more than 45 seconds, triggered a perimeter alert in the security monitoring room because it shared a sensor zone with the loading dock. She discovered this when Park Sung-jin appeared in the kitchen doorway in a tactical vest over a t-shirt, hand already moving toward the weapon at his hip, and found her standing in front of the open refrigerator trying to decide between eggs. "I'm so sorry," she said, with the automatic apology reflex Ji-hoon had already clocked in her. Is there a way to—" "I'll deactivate that sensor from the panel," Park said, and holstered the weapon he'd never fully drawn and left. 3 minutes later, Ji-hoon appeared in the kitchen doorway in a dark gray suit that he had apparently been wearing already, which suggested to Amara that she was not the only pre-dawn person in the mansion. He stopped when he saw her. She was holding a spatula. There was egg on the stove. "I set off your refrigerator alarm," she said. "I'm sorry. Park is fixing it. I was making breakfast. Do you want eggs? I was going to make some for Minjun when he wakes up. I make a good scrambled egg. I'm told that's not impressive, but I think it's underrated." Ji-hoon looked at the stove, at the eggs, at the coffee she'd made, which was filling the kitchen with a smell that the expensive automatic machine he had in his study never quite achieved. He looked at her in her Chicago sweatshirt with the cracked letters, standing in his professional kitchen at 6 in the morning with a spatula. "I've eaten," he said. "Okay." She turned back to the stove. "Coffee's fresh if you want it." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he crossed the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd made rather than from his study machine, and left. Amara scrambled eggs and thought about that for a while. Minjun's room was the center of gravity. She didn't push. That was the first thing. The most important thing she'd learned in 3 years of developmental clinic work with kids who'd been through things. You don't push. You make yourself available. You make yourself consistent. You show up at the same time, in the same way, with the same energy, until the child's nervous system learns that you're a fixed point in the world and begins tentatively to orient toward you. She came to his door at 8 every morning, knocked twice, always twice, same knock, nothing theatrical. Said, "Hey, it's Amara. I'm here. Take your time." And then sat on the floor in the hallway outside his door and read a book, or drew, or just sat until the door opened. Usually 10 minutes, sometimes 20, once 35. She didn't comment on how long it took. She didn't make a production of it when the door opened. She just looked up from whatever she was doing and said, "Good morning," and waited to see what he needed. What he needed for the first week was proximity without demand. He wanted to know she was there without being required to do anything about it. She understood that. She'd given that to other kids in different circumstances, kids who'd been through medical trauma, through family dissolution, through the specific loneliness of being small and confused in a world that kept expecting things from them. The body remembered threat long after the threat was gone. The nervous system kept the score. You had to give it time to revise the math. By the end of the first week, he was eating breakfast at the kitchen table while she made it. By the end of the second, he was sitting in the same room with her while she read aloud from a picture book, not asking him to engage, just reading into the air of the room while he played with his building blocks. And she got to the part where the story's fox crossed a frozen river alone, and she heard very quietly a sound that it took her a moment to identify as a child's laughter, suppressed immediately, gone almost as soon as it appeared. She kept reading, didn't look up. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she hid behind the book. But Ji-hoon watched the security feeds every evening before bed. He told himself this was standard protocol, monitoring the estate, reviewing the day's activity, identifying anything that required his attention. This was, in a narrow and technical sense, true. It was also, in every sense that mattered, not what he was actually doing. What he was actually doing was watching Amara. He watched her in this kitchen at 6 in the morning, talking to herself while she cooked. Full conversations with no audience, the kind of running commentary people develop when they live alone and it becomes a habit. He watched her set off the sensor 3 more times over the course of the first 2 weeks, each time with the same immediate and genuine apology, each time causing Park to deactivate or recalibrate something in a way that was slowly and imperceptibly humanizing the mansion's security infrastructure. He watched her in the garden with Min-jun on the first afternoon she got him outside, not doing anything orchestrated, just sitting on the grass with a box of chalk and drawing badly on purpose, drawing worse and worse until the lines she was making were so absurd that Min-jun reached over and took the chalk from her hand and corrected it. He'd played back that clip 4 times. He watched her at dinner. She ate in the small staff dining room off the kitchen, but sometimes he walked through on his way to the East Wing, and she'd be at the table with a book open next to her plate, reading and eating simultaneously, completely absorbed. Sometimes he stopped. Sometimes he said something brief about the next day's schedule. She always answered with something direct and practical, and then went back to her book, and he always stood there for slightly longer than the conversation warranted before continuing down the hallway. He noticed that she didn't seem aware of this. He found himself, with a clarity he applied to very few things, finding this fact interesting. Seo-ah called twice during the first 2 weeks. He took the calls. She wanted to know when he was reconsidering. He told her there was nothing to reconsider. The second call ended poorly. Ji-hoon put the phone down and looked at his hands for a moment, and then he opened the security feed on his laptop, and there was Amara in the library with Min-jun, both of them on the floor, surrounded by a sprawling construction of building blocks that was clearly meant to be a city, but that Amara kept suggesting, with great seriousness, might also be a dinosaur if viewed from the right angle. Min-jun hadn't laughed out loud yet, but his face was doing things that Ji-hoon hadn't seen it do in over 2 years. The muscles around his eyes were working. The tension that had lived in his son's body like a permanent resident was, in small increments, beginning to pack its bags. Ji-hoon closed the laptop, sat in the dark of his study. His empire was currently engaged in a territorial negotiation with the Black Tiger Syndicate to the south. A situation that was not yet a war, but that required constant, careful management to keep it from becoming one. He had men in 3 cities watching 4 different situations simultaneously. He had 14 people who depended on his continued sharp attention to continue existing in their current states. He had a relationship with the city that required constant maintenance, a web of obligations and leverages, and carefully maintained silences. He opened the laptop again. Amara was explaining to Minjun, with complete seriousness, why the building block dinosaur would definitely beat a real dinosaur in a fight. Jihoon sat there and watched until she finally got a laugh, a real one, short but genuine, a small boy's laugh breaking free of 700 days of silence like water through a fracture. And he felt it somewhere behind his sternum, a sensation so foreign he genuinely didn't know what to do with it. He got up, poured water, and stood at the window of his study and looked at Seoul. He had spent 2 years learning not to feel things quickly. He was very good at it. He did not intend to become worse at it. He went to bed at 1 in the morning and lay in the dark and thought about quarterly projections. The flower incident happened on a Wednesday. Ji-hoon was in the kitchen corridor coming back from the garage when he heard the sound, a sort of percussive thump followed by a snowstorm. He came through the kitchen door and stopped. Amara was standing in the center of the kitchen floor surrounded by a perfect circle of white. A 5-pound bag of flour had apparently been on a shelf it had no business being on, and it had made its descent in a way that distributed its contents with impressive thoroughness. There was flour on the counters, flour on the stovetop, a fine coating of flour across every surface within a 2-meter radius, and across Ji-hoon's left shoe. He looked down at the shoe. The shoe was white. "I am," Amara said, from the center of the flour circle, her voice carrying the specific tone of someone who has transcended immediate embarrassment and achieved something close to resignation. "So sorry, that was... the shelf was... I was reaching for the baking powder and I..." Ji-hoon looked at the shoe. Then he looked at her. She had flour in her hair and flour on her face and flour on both arms up to the elbows. And she was looking at his shoe with the expression of someone doing rapid internal calculations about whether this was the event that ended her employment. "These shoes are Italian," he said. "I know, I could tell. I'm sorry." He looked at the shoe for a long moment. "How did you get flour on the ceiling?" Amara looked up. There was indeed flour on the ceiling, a significant amount of it. She seemed to be seeing this for the first time. "I genuinely don't know," she said. "I think the bag, when it fell, it was a sealed bag." "I know. A sealed bag of flour doesn't..." "I know." He looked at the ceiling. He looked at her. Something happened in his face that he shut down before it fully arrived. He called for Park to send a cleaning crew, told Amara to get the flour out of her hair, and walked out of the kitchen with 1 white shoe and 1 black one. In the security monitoring room, Park Sung-jin watched the clip back twice and did not tell anyone what he thought about what he'd seen on the general's face. The first time Minjun spoke to Amara, it was 3 weeks and 4 days into her employment, and it happened at 7:42 in the morning in the kitchen. She was making pancakes. She'd introduced pancakes on week 2 as a deliberate tactical choice. They required just enough active participation to be interesting, and the smell was disarming in a way that was hard to resist. She'd gotten Minjun to hand her the spatula once, then twice. She'd let him pour the batter. She'd made 2 that were badly shaped and pointed at them and said they looked like clouds, and he'd tilted his head and looked at them, and she'd seen on his face the beginning of an opinion about this. On day 25, she made a pancake that was spectacularly, catastrophically lopsided. So lopsided that it was essentially a parenthesis, a curved line of cooked batter that had no relationship to any geometric form she'd intended. She stared at it on the pan. She said, "That's a shoe. That is definitely a shoe." From beside her at the counter, very quietly, so quietly she almost didn't catch it, "It's not a shoe." She went completely still. Minjun was looking at the pancake. His small face was serious. "It's a whale," he said. Amara looked at the pancake. She looked at him. She looked back at the pancake. "You're right," she said. "It's absolutely a whale." She flipped it. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she almost dropped the spatula. She made 3 more whale pancakes on purpose after that, and they ate all of them at the kitchen table, and she talked about whales, things she knew about them, things that were interesting, facts she was making up that she was fairly sure sounded plausible, and Minjun ate and listened and said nothing else. But he'd said it. He'd said 2 things. It was not a shoe, It was a whale. That afternoon, Ji-hoon came home from a meeting in Gangnam 2 hours earlier than his scheduled return. He came into the kitchen and she was there cleaning up the lunch dishes, and something in his face when he looked at her was different. Not different in a way she could name, but different in the way of a person who has been told something and is recalibrating. Park had told him. He talked, Ji-hoon said. Not a question. Yeah. She dried her hands on the dish towel. 2 sentences. He told me my pancake looked like a whale. Ji-hoon stood very still in the kitchen doorway. Did it? He said finally. Absolutely. He nodded once. He left the kitchen. She heard him stop outside Min-jun's room in the hallway. Heard the knock, twice, the same knock she always used, and she heard Min-jun's door open, and then she didn't hear anything else. But she stood in the kitchen with the dish towel in her hands and did not move for a long time. The night the assassin came, it was raining. Seoul had been doing this lately. The late autumn storms that arrived without announcement, heavy and vertical, turning the hillside into a kind of rushing darkness. Amara couldn't sleep. She never slept well when it rained heavily. It had been something since childhood, a low-grade alertness that the sound of rain on a roof activated and that no amount of practice had fully dimmed. She lay in her room in the east wing and listened to the water against the window and thought about Min-jun's voice and whether it would come again and what it would take to make it come back more often. And then she thought about the way Ji-hoon had looked standing in her kitchen doorway that afternoon. And then she stopped thinking about that. She got up at 2:15, put on socks, pulled the Chicago sweatshirt on over her sleep shirt, padded down the hallway toward the kitchen because her body had apparently decided that 3 weeks of pre-dawn kitchen occupancy constituted a routine that it now enforced regardless of the hour. The kitchen was dark and quiet. The rain was audible through the walls. She left the main lights off and turned on the low cabinet light under the counter, enough to see by, not enough to feel awake, and opened the refrigerator. She was looking at leftovers. There were leftovers from dinner, the galbi that Ji-hoon's cook had made and that she'd eaten carefully at the staff table, trying not to make sounds about how good it was and mostly failing. There was a bowl of something covered in plastic. There was half a slice of the apple cake that Min-jun had consented to eat a bite of that afternoon. She pulled the galbi out, set it on the counter, reached across the counter for a fork. The milk was in the way. She moved it. It resisted. She moved it more definitely. It came free from whatever it had been wedged against and tilted, and the lid, which had not been fully sealed, released, and the milk went across the counter and off the edge and hit the floor. Specifically, it hit the floor at the precise moment that a shape detached from the darkness near the service entrance at the far end of the kitchen and moved toward her. And the sound of the milk hitting the floor coincided exactly with the shape taking a step, and the floor was tile, and the tile was now wet, and Amara's socked foot came down on the puddle of milk as she spun toward the counter to catch the jug. She went down. Her feet went left. Her body went right. Her arms went out. She was falling backward and sideways simultaneously in a way that the laws of physics seemed to find amusing, and she hit something solid, something that was not the counter and not the floor, and that grunted sharply on impact. And then there was a tremendous sound, a crack that she felt in her teeth, and the floor came up and got her, and she was sitting in spilled milk and mayonnaise from somewhere. She wasn't sure where the mayonnaise had come from. And there was a man lying face down on the kitchen tiles 2 feet from where she sat. He was not moving. He was dressed in black. There was a gun on the floor near his hand, a suppressed pistol, the kind built for quiet work. Amara looked at the gun. She looked at the man. She looked at the gun again. Her brain was running at a speed she was not used to, fast and flat, stripped down to pure signal. She registered, unconscious. She registered, weapon. She registered the edge of the granite countertop above the man's head, where he had apparently made contact on his way down. She registered that her back hurt in a way that suggested she would feel it for days. She was still registering all of this when the kitchen door came open and Ji-hoon appeared, not walking, but moving the way she'd never seen him move before, fast and low and precise, with 2 of his guards behind him and weapons drawn. And he swept the room in under 2 seconds, and his eyes landed on the man on the floor and then on her. He stared at her. She was sitting in a puddle of milk and mayonnaise with a galbi container in one hand and her hair in her face and her Chicago sweatshirt covered in various liquids. And there was a professional assassin, one of the most feared contracted killers in the Korean underworld, lying unconscious on the floor beside her. "He fell," she said. I fell, and then he fell. There was milk. I didn't know he was... I'm sorry about the kitchen. This is a lot of... Something happened to Ji-hoon's face. It started in the eyes. A fracture in the controlled surface of him, something giving way. It moved to his jaw. It arrived at his mouth. And then Kang Ji-hoon, the man whose cold reputation had been built over a decade, the man who had not laughed in 2 years, the man who conducted the business of organized crime with the affectless precision of a surgeon, started laughing. Not a polite sound, not a controlled exhale. Real laughter, the helpless kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below your ribs and climbs out whether you want it to or not. He laughed and put one hand on the doorframe to hold himself up, and his guards stared at him as though they'd never seen the function before. Amara looked at him. She looked at the assassin. She looked back at Ji-hoon. Is this... She looked at the gun on the floor. The pieces were assembling themselves in her brain in an order she didn't like. Was he going to... Ji-hoon got himself back under control by degrees. Looked at her. His eyes, when they were direct like this, were too much. She had noticed this before, filed it away, declined to examine it. Are you hurt? My back, she said. And I'm sitting in mayonnaise. Why is there mayonnaise? Can you stand? Yes, obviously. She stood, which proved to be the wrong word for what her legs did, and Ji-hoon crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and caught her arm before she went back down. And she was suddenly very aware of being cold and damp and held upright by a man who smelled like bergamot and something darker underneath it. And she was also aware that there was an unconscious assassin on the floor and 2 guards watching them both. You're going to tell me what's happening, she said. Ji-hoon looked at her for a moment. The laughter was gone from his face. What was underneath it was harder to read. Yes, he said. I am. But in the morning, 2 hours after the security team had removed the assassin from the kitchen, and Park had personally overseen the cleaning crew, and Ji-hoon had sat across from Amara in the small staff dining room and told her more than he told anyone in years, more than she'd asked for, more than was operationally necessary. Amara got up early and made breakfast anyway. She made scrambled eggs. She made whale pancakes. She left a cup of coffee near the kitchen doorway. Ji-hoon found it there at 6:30 and stood for a long time looking at it before he picked it up. It was Park Sung-jin who first brought Ji-hoon the intelligence report that made everything shift. The Black Tiger Syndicate had a new source of information about the estate, not just operational data, security routes, shift rotations, sensor positions, personal information, information about the household, information that had to come from somewhere very close. Ji-hoon read the report in his study at 9 in the morning with the door closed and the security feed open on one screen. He was quiet for a long time after. "Seo-ah," he said. Park didn't answer, which was its own answer. Ji-hoon set the report down on his desk. He looked at his hands. He thought about Seo-ah stretched across the sitting room sofa, so carefully effortless. He thought about the precision of what had been leaked, not just logistics, but timing, patterns, the information of someone who had spent years in this house and knew its rhythms. He thought about what the Black Tiger Syndicate's leader, Baek Do-hwan, would do with that information, what he was probably already planning. He thought about Min-jun in the kitchen that morning, saying, "whale." He thought about Amara on the kitchen floor and the milk and the mayonnaise. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Double the interior rotation," he said when Park answered. "Full perimeter sweep every hour. And find me everything Baek Do-hwan has moved in the last 30 days. He put the phone down. He looked at the security feed. Amara was in the garden with Min-jun, both of them in coats against the autumn cold, and she was teaching him something. Demonstrating with her arms, the way you demonstrate something physical. And Min-jun was watching and then trying to copy it. And even on the low-resolution feed, Ji-hoon could see his son's face, open, concentrated, alive. Ji-hoon stared at that image for a long time. Then he opened the intelligence file on Baek Do-hwan and began to plan. Min-jun's birthday was in 2 weeks. Amara had been thinking about it since week 1. had clocked the date on the household schedule, had filed it in the back of her planning mind as a fixed point to build toward. The boy's last birthday had been 4 months after his mother's death, and from what she could piece together from careful questions and what Ji-hoon had told her without being asked, which was more than she'd expected, delivered in a flat, spare cadence as though he was making a report to himself. The last birthday had been bad. Quiet in the wrong way. A cake nobody ate. She wanted this one to be different. She'd gotten Min-jun talking more in the last week. Not full conversations, not yet, but words. Fragments. Opinions delivered very quietly about very specific things. He thought the building block dinosaur could beat a real one. He thought orange was a better color than red. He thought the guard's dog, which was officially prohibited from entering the East Wing, should be allowed in the East Wing. She agreed with him on all counts. She'd asked him, carefully, not pushing, what kind of cake he liked. He'd been quiet for a moment. Then, chocolate. She'd written it down like it mattered, because it did. She was planning to make it herself. She was aware this carried risk. She accepted the risk. On the evening before the birthday, a Tuesday night, 2 weeks and 3 days into autumn, she was in the kitchen at 8:30, gathering ingredients, running calculations, looking at the recipe she'd adapted from her grandmother's with the modifications she'd developed in 3 years of making birthday cakes for kids. In the clinic who needed something to celebrate. Ji-hoon came through the kitchen doorway. He stopped when he saw her, looked at the ingredients spread across the counter. "What are you doing?" "Birthday cake." She was measuring flour, carefully, very carefully, with the bag held away from her body at a stabilizing angle that she'd been refining since the incident. "I'm making Min-jun's birthday cake tomorrow." Ji-hoon was quiet. He looked at the counter, at the recipe card. "I'll have the kitchen staff—" "I'm doing it," she said. Not aggressive, just clear. He looked at her. "Okay," he said, poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table, and Amara measured flour, and neither of them spoke for a while. And it was somehow not uncomfortable, which was itself a thing she was going to have to examine later, in private, when there was distance and perspective. "He said chocolate," Ji-hoon said eventually. "I know." "He told me too, this morning." A pause. "He came to my study." Amara looked up. Ji-hoon was looking at the table. "He knocked on the door. I almost didn't realize. He came in and he said he wanted a chocolate birthday cake." He stopped. Those were the first words he'd said to me since... He stopped again. Amara turned back to the bowl. She cracked an egg with precise attention. "2 more weeks," she said, "and you won't be able to get him to stop talking." Ji-hoon was quiet for a long time. "I believe you," he said. Not. The birthday was 2 days away when the first alarm went off. Not the refrigerator sensor, not the loading dock. This was different. This was every alarm in the mansion going off at once at 10:47 in the evening, a sound like the building itself deciding to scream. And in the east wing, Amara was on her feet before she was fully awake, moving toward Min-jun's room on the instinct of someone who'd spent the last month with a child's safety as her primary operational parameter. The hallway was flashing red. The emergency lighting system had kicked on. She could hear the guards moving, the sound of men running, of equipment being readied, of the estate's security infrastructure shifting from its nighttime state to something else entirely. She got to Min-jun's door. She knocked twice, fast. "Amara!" His voice came back immediately. He'd been awake. "I'm here, stay right there, I'm coming in." She opened the door. He was in the center of his bed in his pajamas, small and upright, his hands in his lap. He looked at her with eyes that were older than they should have been, eyes that had already learned, the hard way, that alarms in the night meant something. "It's okay," she said. She went to him, sat on the bed beside him. She was shaking. She didn't let him see that. Down the hallway, the sound of gunfire shook the walls. Min-jun pressed closer to her side, and she put her arm around him and held on. And the world outside the bedroom door erupted into something she didn't have framework for. And all she knew, in the clear and animal way of a body that has decided its priorities, was that this child was staying exactly where he was. Below them, in the mansion's kitchen, the birthday cake sat on the counter in its pan, not yet frosted, chocolate still warm from the oven. And the men coming through the breach in the east garden wall were moving fast, moving toward everything she'd built in 30 days. And somewhere in the chaos, Kang Ji-hoon was fighting toward his family through the dark. The gunfire stopped before Amara fully understood it had started. That was the thing about violence at close range. It didn't sound the way she'd expected from movies. It wasn't clean or cinematic. It was a series of hard, flat sounds that her brain kept misidentifying. Backfire, something dropped, a door. And then the smell reached her and her body understood what her brain was refusing to process. And she pulled Min-jun harder against her side and pressed his face into her shoulder and put herself between him and the door. He didn't fight her. He went still against her the way small animals go still. Complete cessation of movement. His fingers found the fabric of her sweatshirt and gripped. The shouting was in Korean, fast and clipped and overlapping. She caught fragments, enough to know it was orders and responses, the sound of an operation rather than a massacre. And she filed that distinction away as meaningful, even though she wasn't sure she was right. She was counting. She didn't know why she was counting. 11 seconds between the last shot and the current silence. 15. 20. Then footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, fast, multiple people. She got up from the bed and stood in front of Min-jun. The door came open and Park Sung-jin was there. Tactical vest, radio in hand, blood on the left side of his neck that he was apparently not prioritizing. Behind him, 2 guards she recognized from the East Garden rotation. Ms. Brooks. Park's voice was completely level. Please, come with us. Min-jun first. Yes, both of you. Now. She reached back for Min-jun's hand without looking. He took it. They moved them to the interior security room on the ground floor, a room she hadn't known existed until this moment, behind a panel in the corridor off the main hall, the kind of room that announced very clearly what kind of house this actually was. Reinforced walls, monitors showing every camera feed, a cabinet she was not going to think about yet. 2 guards inside already, a third at the door. Min-jun sat on the bench along the wall. He still hadn't made a sound. Amara sat next to him. She was holding his hand and she was watching the monitors. The feeds showed men in tactical positions throughout the estate grounds. Ji-hoon's men, she understood, recognizable by their organization. They were moving in patterns she couldn't read, sweeping the outer garden, converging on something at the east wall. There were shapes on the ground in several places that she looked at once and did not look at again. Where is he? She said. Park was at the main console. He glanced at her. Where is Ji-hoon? She said, handling the situation. That's not what I asked. Park looked at her again. The flat, assessing look he'd given her the first day, the one that was calculating without being unkind. He pointed to a feed on the upper right monitor. She found it. The courtyard camera, south side, and there was Ji-hoon, jacket gone, moving through the courtyard with 2 guards flanking him, speaking into his radio, not running but covering ground at a pace that suggested running was beneath the current threat level. He was upright. He was functional. He was doing what he was doing. She let go of the breath she'd been holding since the first alarm. Min-jun beside her made a very small sound. Not a word. Just evidence of being alive. He's okay, Amara said quietly. Your dad's okay. Ji-hoon came to the security room 40 minutes later. He came in without knocking, which was consistent with a room inside his own house, and he scanned the space in 2 seconds. Taking inventory the way she'd seen him take inventory of every room he entered, the habit of a man whose continued existence had depended for a long time on rapid environmental assessment. His eyes went to Min-jun first, then to her. He crossed to the bench and crouched down to Min-jun's level, and he said something in Korean, quiet and direct. Min-jun looked at him. There was a moment between them, the particular wordlessness of a child and a parent who are both trying to navigate a situation neither has language for. And then Min-jun leaned forward and put his head against his father's shoulder. Ji-hoon went very still. He stayed there for a moment that Amara looked away from because it was not hers to watch. When she looked back, Ji-hoon was standing. He gestured to one of the guards, who took a position near Min-jun. Then he looked at Amara and moved his head toward the door. She followed him into the corridor. He told her in the hallway, low and fast, the way he told her things when he'd already run the calculation and decided on the quantity. The breach had come through the East Garden wall, a 4-man entry team, professional, equipped. They disabled one perimeter sensor and almost a second one before his interior team engaged. The operation had been stopped. The men were either secured or not a problem anymore, and he said that second part in a way that she understood without needing specification. They were after you, he said. She heard it. Me. You specifically. The entry pattern. They went for the east wing first. Your room. He said it without inflection, which was somehow worse than if there had been inflection. Dohwan has decided you are the pressure point. I'm the nanny. You're the reason Minjun is speaking again. He said it flat, like a fact. Dohwan is not an idiot. He understands leverage. Amara stood in the corridor and looked at the wall. She was aware of her heartbeat in a specific way. The way you become aware of something only when you're evaluating whether it's going to keep working. Okay, she said. Okay. What does that mean in practical terms? For Minjun's birthday. In 2 days. Jihoon looked at her. The cake is still in the oven, she said. It's been in the oven for about an hour. It's probably done. I want to know what tomorrow looks like before I think about the bigger picture. Something moved through his expression. Fast, then gone. Tomorrow is locked down. Nobody in or out without my direct authorization. Can I get the cake out of the oven? A pause. Yes. Okay. She turned back toward the kitchen corridor. Tell me everything else in the morning. I can handle it in the morning. She heard him say her name once behind her. She stopped. The information they used to plan the breach, he said. The sensor positions. The east wing schedule. That came from inside. She turned around. His face was carefully composed. It was the face he used when he'd already made a decision and was informing you of the coordinates rather than asking for input. C-O-Ah. Amara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the receiving room, the click of precise heels on marble, the contempt that had been clean and cold and very certain of itself. You didn't know, she said. I knew some of it, not this. What happens now? I'm handling it. She nodded once and went to get the birthday cake out of the oven. The cake was fine. This seemed improbable, and also, given the evening's full inventory of events, somewhat beside the point, but it was true. She pulled it out at 11:43, and it had done exactly what chocolate cake was supposed to do, and she set it on the cooling rack and looked at it for a while, and then she sat down at the kitchen table in the low light with her hands in her lap. Her hands were shaking. She'd known they were shaking since the security room. She'd been managing it, keeping them occupied, keeping them visible to herself only, not letting Minjun see. Now there was no one to manage it for, and they shook, and she let them. There were shapes on the grounds outside that she was not going to think about. There was an unconscious assassin from 10 days ago who had apparently been the opening act. There was a woman she'd met for 3 minutes in a receiving room who had taken careful, deliberate aim at this household and pulled the trigger without getting her hands on any actual weapons. Amara sat in the kitchen and shook and smelled chocolate and waited for it to pass. It took about 7 minutes. Then she got up and started the frosting. In the morning, Jihoon was already at the kitchen table when she came in. This was new. He was there with coffee and an open laptop and the specific tension of a man who had been sitting in one place for a while after not sleeping. There were dark patches under his eyes that his composure was working hard to override. She made eggs. She put a plate in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. You don't have to eat the eggs. She went back to the stove. He ate the eggs. Minjun came down at 8, later than usual, drawn by whatever instinct children have towards stability after disruption, wanting to confirm that the anchor points were still in place. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas and looked at his father, and then at Amara, and then at the chocolate cake sitting on the counter under a cloth. Is that mine? He said. It will be, Amara said. 2 more days. Minjun considered this. He looked at his father. Did you sleep? The question landed in the kitchen with the specific weight of a child asking the thing nobody else had asked. Jihoon put his coffee cup down. He looked at his son with an expression that had nothing controlled in it, nothing managed. Just a man caught completely open by a 7-year-old who'd come downstairs in his pajamas and looked directly at him. No, Jihoon said. Minjun nodded as though this was information he'd expected. He walked to his father's chair and climbed up onto the seat beside him in the companionable way of a child who has decided that presence is the appropriate response to honesty. Ji-hoon sat very still. Amara turned back to the stove and said nothing. Seo-ah arrived at the gate at 10 in the morning. Ji-hoon was in his study on a call. Park Sung-jin came to the kitchen doorway and told Amara, because Amara was currently the closest adult not occupied with a security debrief, and she understood immediately from the way Park told her, carefully, without expression, watching her face, that this information was being delivered in case she needed to prepare herself. "Is he letting her in?" Amara asked. "He's aware she's here." "That's not what I asked." Park maintained the expression. "He hasn't said no." Amara looked at the cake under the cloth. She looked at the window over the garden, where Min-jun was currently in the grass with the guard's dog that was still officially prohibited from the east wing, throwing a stick and getting it retrieved and throwing it again with the focused seriousness of a child working through something. "Okay," she said. She went upstairs to her room and sat on the bed and looked at her hands, which were steady now. She thought about several things in sequence. She thought about the receiving room floor and the orange crayon. She thought about whale pancakes. She thought about Min-jun's voice saying it's not a shoe, it's a whale, which was the first thing she'd heard from him and which she had replayed so many times in her head in the last 3 weeks that she could reconstruct every phoneme, every breath between words. She thought about Ji-hoon eating the eggs without argument. She thought about Seo-ah at the gate and what a woman like that wanted when she came back to a place she'd been removed from. She wasn't angry, exactly. Anger was a thing she had trained out of herself over years. Not suppressed, not buried, but genuinely metabolized into something more useful. What she had instead was a very clear awareness of exactly what mattered and exactly what the threat to it was. She got up and went back downstairs. Shoa was in the sitting room. She was standing rather than sitting, which told Amara something. She was in a coat she hadn't removed, which told her something else. She'd been given access to the sitting room and not to anything beyond it, which was Park's calculation and a correct one. Amara stopped in the doorway. Seo-ah turned. She looked at Amara for a moment with an evaluation that was so thorough and so openly derisive that it almost looped back around to being impressive. "Where's Ji-hoon?" she said. Not to Amara specifically, to the room. "He's aware you're here." "I didn't ask you." "No." Amara came into the room. She didn't sit down. Neither did Seo-ah. They stood on opposite sides of the coffee table like people who have already agreed on the terms of something and are just finalizing the details. "I'm not sure why you came." Seo-ah's eyes moved across her. The particular scan of a woman who has been using appearance as currency for so long that she assesses everything and everyone through that framework instinctively. "You wouldn't understand why. Try me." A pause. Seo-ah's jaw adjusted slightly. "This is his world, his life. I belong in it. You are—" She searched for the word with a visible flicker of pleasure at the searching temporary. "Maybe." Amar's voice was even. "But right now I'm standing in his kitchen, and Min-jun is in the garden, and his birthday is in 2 days, and you're standing in this room in your coat, so." The silence stretched. Seo-ah said, "I grew up poor, did you know that? Before the cameras, before all of this." She gestured at the room, at the art, the furniture, the weight of the place. "I built everything myself. I did not get here by being soft. I did not get here by being—" She stopped. "Clumsy?" Amara said. "Saying sorry too much? Wrong size?" Seo-ah's expression did something complicated. "I know what you did," Amara said. "With the security routes." The expression closed, went flat and deliberate. "You don't know anything. Men came through the east wall last night. My room was the first stop on their list." She said it clean and direct, no performance in it. Min-jun was 50 feet from that. So. The room was very quiet. Seo-ah looked at her. For the first time since Amara had entered the room, something in her assessment was not entirely derisive. It was something else, harder to read, edged with something that might have been, under layers of other things, close to the shape of shame. "Get out of this house," Seo-ah said, but it came out quieter than she'd intended. "No." Ji-hoon's voice came from the doorway. They both turned. He was standing in the entrance to the sitting room with his hands in his pockets and his face in the particular configuration it took when he had already made every decision that needed to be made and was now operating in the post-decision space. His eyes went to Amara first, a brief inventory, functional, checking, then to Seo-ah. "You need to leave," he said. Ji-hoon." Her voice shifted. It went to a register Amara hadn't heard from her before. Lower, less performed. An appeal. "We need to talk. Privately. There's nothing private that changes what you did. You don't understand the full... Do-hwan's men were in my house last night." His voice didn't change pitch. Didn't need to. "With a specific target. My son was 40 feet away." He paused. Park. Park appeared in the hallway behind him, which meant Park had been in the hallway the entire time, which meant none of this had been uncontrolled. So-ah looked at Ji-hoon, at Park, at Amara. Her face moved through several expressions with the rapid cycling of a woman whose calculations are updating in real time and coming up short. "This isn't finished," she said. "Yes," Ji-hoon said, "it is." She left. Park accompanied her to the gate, and the sound of the gate closing came through the sitting room window with a finality that sat differently than the sound of the last time she'd left. Shit. Ji-hoon was on the phone for 3 hours after that. Amara took Min-jun to the garden. They threw the stick for the dog. They sat in the grass and she talked about things. The lake in Chicago in winter, the way it frosted over at the edges but not the middle, the birds she'd seen on the shoreline. Min-jun listened. He asked once what the lake smelled like. "Cold," she said, "like metal and water and something alive underneath." He considered this. "We have the Han River." "I know. I saw it from my window. My mom used to take me to look at it." He said it in the flat, factual way children said enormous things when they'd been carrying them long enough that the weight had become familiar. At night, when the lights were on it, Amara looked at him. He was looking at the dog, who was investigating something in the grass with focused canine attention. "She sounds like she was good at that," Amara said, finding the right thing to look at. Min-jun was quiet. Then, "Yeah." She didn't push. She looked at the garden wall still, the east garden wall, the one that had been breached 9 hours ago. And she thought about what it meant to have something worth protecting and what it cost to stay in the vicinity of people who wanted to take it from you. She thought about Chicago, her apartment, the clinic, the before. She thought about an orange crayon on a marble floor. She looked at Min-jun with the dog in the autumn garden and made a decision that she didn't record or announce to anyone, just settled into herself quietly and let it become true. Ji-hoon found her in the kitchen at 7. She was finishing the frosting. The cake was assembled on the counter. 3 layers, level as she could get them. The chocolate frosting applied with the careful imprecision of someone who was skilled at enough things that imprecision in decorating registered as a choice rather than a failure. She was writing Min-jun's name across the top in careful letters. Ji-hoon stood in the doorway and watched her do it. "The situation with Do-hwan," he said. "I know. It's not resolved. I know that too. You should be concerned about your safety." She kept the frosting moving. "I am." "You don't..." He stopped. Tried a different door. "Most people in your position would want to leave." "I'm not most people in my position." She finished the N, stepped back, looked at the cake. "Also, Min-jun's birthday is tomorrow. I'm not leaving before his birthday." Ji-hoon looked at the cake, at her name written in careful chocolate frosting letters, the slight wobble in the J where she'd adjusted. "After?" he said. "Ask me after." She put the piping bag down, turned to face him properly. "What's your actual plan for Do-hwan?" He told her, more than he should have, probably. She watched him register this as he spoke, the slight recalibration of a man who keeps his operational details close and is discovering that he's been telling this woman more than he tells his lieutenants for 3 weeks running and has not yet decided how he feels about that. He told her about the intelligence they were gathering, about the financial channels they were tracking, about the trap that was being assembled, slowly, with the patience of a man who understood that the best closing move was one the other person didn't see coming until the geometry was already complete. She listened. She asked 2 questions, both specific and operational. He answered them with the slight pause of a man who is adjusting his categorization of someone in real time. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm afraid all the time," she said. "I was shaking for 45 minutes last night. I'm just not going to act like it when Min-jun can see me." Ji-hoon looked at her for a moment that was too long to be comfortable and too weighted to be casual. Then he looked at the cake. "He'll like it," he said. "I know. It's a good cake." The edge of his mouth moved. Not quite what it had been in the kitchen 10 days ago. The real laughter, the helpless kind. But related to it. A cousin of it. She turned back to clean up the frosting tools. He stayed in the doorway for a moment, and she was aware of him staying there, and she was also aware that she was aware of it. And that was a problem she was going to need to address in the privacy of her own head when there was time. The birthday was 17 hours away when Park came to find Ji-hoon at 11 that night. Amara was already in bed, had gone up at 10, knowing she needed the sleep, knowing tomorrow required everything she had. She heard footsteps in the corridor. She heard Park's voice, muffled but urgent, the particular compression of a man delivering information that has a clock attached to it. She heard Ji-hoon's response. One word. She sat up in bed. There was a long pause in the corridor, then more footsteps, heavier, faster, moving toward the east wing rather than away from it. She got up, opened her door. The hallway was empty, but at the far end she could see the red glow of the secondary alarm panel that Park monitored from the security room. It was showing a color she hadn't seen before, not the amber of a routine alert, something else. Her phone lit up on the nightstand, a message from an unknown number, 3 words, tomorrow, everything, everyone. She stared at it. Her mind went to the cake under the cloth in the kitchen. Min-jun's name in chocolate frosting. An orange crayon on a marble floor, a whale pancake. 2 words from a child who'd been holding his silence for 700 days. She went to Min-jun's door and knocked twice. "Amara?" His voice came back immediately, already awake, already waiting. "I'm here," she said. "Don't open the door yet. I need to get your dad." She moved fast down the hallway toward the east stairwell, and behind her, in the security room's glow, every panel that Park Sung-jin was watching shifted to red at once, and the sound that followed was not the controlled percussion of a security team responding to a threat. It was something else entirely, something that shook the walls from below, and Amara was already running when the lights went out. The lights came back in 4 seconds. Emergency power, the deep hum of generators kicking in below the basement level, and the hallway went from complete darkness to the red-washed emergency lighting that made everything look like the inside of something wounded. Amara had her hand on the east stairwell door, and she stopped, because the sound that had shaken the walls had not repeated, and the absence of its repetition was information she was trying to read. Not an explosion. Structural. Something below. The power grid. Someone had hit the power grid. She went back to Min-jun's door. "I'm still here. Stay inside. Lock it." "Amara!" "Lock it, Min-jun." She heard the lock engage. She moved. The east stairwell was clear. She went down fast, one hand on the rail, the red light making the stairs look like they went somewhere she didn't want to go. She hit the ground floor and came through the door into the main corridor and nearly ran into Park, who was moving in the opposite direction with 2 guards and a radio that was producing a steady stream of voices she couldn't parse fast enough. "What hit us?" she said. "Power substation on the south perimeter." Park was already moving past her. "Shaped charge. Took out the primary feed and the backup junction. That's why the panels went red all at once." He stopped and looked at her with the flat, recalibrating look. "Yes." "Where's Ji-hoon?" "Command position in the security room. Ms. Brooks, I need you to go back upstairs." "Where's Do-hwan's team coming from?" Park's jaw tightened. He said nothing, which told her everything. They weren't tracking a direction yet, or they were tracking too many directions simultaneously. She didn't ask which. She went to the security room. Bomb. Ji-hoon was standing at the main console when she came through the panel door. He turned, and she could see him run the same inventory he always ran, assessing, cataloging, filing the result. And she could see from the speed of it that he was operating at a different level than she'd seen before. Stripped down, all the social machinery offline, just the part of him that had kept him alive for 10 years in a world that wanted him dead. "Min-jun," he said, locked in his room. I told him to stay. Good. He turned back to the monitors. Half of them were dark. The cameras on the south and east perimeters were down, which was not a coincidence. Someone had mapped the camera positions before cutting the power. We have movement on the north approach. 2 vehicles. 8 to 12 personnel estimated. The south perimeter cameras are down. I know. So you don't know what's coming from the south. He looked at her sideways. That's the point. She stood next to him at the console and looked at the remaining feeds. The north approach, the front gate, the interior courtyard, the west garden. On the north feed, she could see the headlights. 2 sets, moving slowly, no urgency, the pace of something that has already decided the outcome of what it's doing. This is different from last night, she said. Last night was a test. His voice was flat. This is the actual problem. She looked at the headlights on the feed. She thought about the text message. Tomorrow. Everything. Everyone. And she thought about the fact that tomorrow had become tonight, which meant someone had moved the schedule, which meant something had changed in Do Hwan's calculation. What changed? She said. Ji-hoon's hand paused over the console. Fraction of a second. She caught it. What changed? She said again, differently. He didn't look at her. He picked up the radio and issued 3 instructions in Korean, rapid and precise, and the guards in the room moved. Then he set the radio down and he said, "Seo-ah." Amara waited. She called Do Hwan after she left here. I have the intercept. He still wasn't looking at her. She told him the interior security count, the generator location, the camera grid. A pause. She also told him about Min Jun's birthday. The birthday. She told him the household would be distracted. He turned away from the console. He was looking at the wall. She told him the frosting was already on the cake. The room was very quiet except for the radio traffic. Amara felt something cold move through her that wasn't fear. It was closer to clarity. The terrible, stripping kind of clarity that came when a situation removed all its ambiguity and left you with just the undecorated facts. So she didn't just give him the security routes, Amara said. No. She timed it. She planned it around... She stopped. Started again. Around Min Jun's birthday. Specifically. Ji-hoon's back was to her. The muscles in his shoulders were doing something she'd never seen them do. Yes. Amara put her hand flat on the console. It was the only movement she allowed herself. 1 hand, flat surface, 4 seconds. Then she said, "Okay, what do you need me to do?" What he needed her to do was stay in the security room with 2 guards and the monitors and not move, which was what he said when he turned around, and she looked at him and said, "That's not what I'm doing." And he looked back at her and opened his mouth and she said, "Min Jun is upstairs, and if this building gets breached from the south while you're managing the north approach, he needs someone who knows his knock." A long moment. Ji-hoon closed his mouth. He looked at Park. Park said nothing. Park was very good at saying nothing at crucial moments. "Stay with Min Jun," Ji-hoon said finally. "Do not open that door for anyone except Park or me. Do you hear me?" "Yes." "Amara." She'd already turned toward the panel door. She looked back. His face was doing the thing it did when the controlled surface wasn't entirely working. The fracture she'd first seen in the receiving room when Min Jun picked up the orange crayon. The thing underneath that was less constructed and less safe. He looked at her for 2 seconds that were too much to leave unexamined and not enough to examine right now. "Go," he said. She went. Min Jun's room was quiet when she got back upstairs, which she understood was its own form of communication. Children went quiet in different ways. His quiet was the occupied kind, the sound of a small person doing something private with his fear, rather than releasing it into the air of the room. She knocked twice. "It's me." The lock disengaged. She came in. He was in the center of his bed again, the same position from last night, pajamas, hands in his lap, but this time he had the orange crayon, the one from the receiving room. She hadn't known he still had it. He was holding it in both hands, turning it slowly, his thumb moving across the paper label the way it had that first day. And he looked up at her and she could see from his face exactly how much he understood about the situation and exactly how hard he was working not to show it. He was 7 years old and he was holding himself together with both hands and a crayon. She sat on the bed. She didn't do anything elaborate. She just sat beside him the way she'd sat beside him every morning for 30 days, consistent and present and not requiring anything from the moment. And after a while, his shoulder found her arm and he leaned in slightly. They sat. Below them, the sound of the estate reorganizing itself into a defensive configuration came up through the floors in fragments, footsteps, doors, the crackle of radios, the particular orchestrated tension of men preparing for something. The emergency lighting gave Minjun's room the quality of somewhere held in suspension, outside the normal movement of time. "Are they coming back?" Minjun said. "I don't know." He considered this. "Is my dad going to be okay?" She had been asked this question in different words by different children, more times than she could count. She had learned in 3 years of clinical work exactly what not to say. The empty assurances that children's nervous systems recognized as dishonest the moment they heard them, the false certainties that trained a child to distrust comfort. She had learned that what children in crisis actually needed was not a promise, but a presence. Someone who would stay in the uncertainty with them rather than paper over it. "Your dad is very good at taking care of himself," she said, "and he has a lot of people helping him. And I'm right here." Minjun turned the crayon in his hands. "Okay," he said, not satisfied, not reassured, just received, filed, proceeding. She thought, not for the first time, this kid is going to be something. Oops. The breach came from the south. She felt it before she heard it. A concussive pressure change in the building's atmosphere. A deep thud that was different in character from last night's sounds, lower and more deliberate. Then the alarm panel in the hallway outside changed pitch, and her phone. Ji-hoon had given her a security-linked device 2 days after the first assassination attempt. Replacing her personal phone in an act of operational pragmatism she'd chosen not to examine too carefully. Lit up with a red notification. South Wing, Interior Breach, Level 1. She looked at Minjun. "We're going to the closet," she said. Not a question, not a negotiation. He got up. He brought the crayon. The closet was walk-in, deep, with a second door that Ji-hoon had shown her on a quiet Tuesday afternoon that led to a connecting passage between the East Wing rooms. She'd filed it away with the other operational information she was accumulating about this house, and had hoped she'd never use. She positioned Minjun in the back corner behind the winter coats that smelled like cedar and something older, and she crouched in front of him. "You don't move," she said. "You don't make a sound. I'm going to be right outside this door." "You said you'd stay with me." "I will be right outside this door." Minjun looked at her. His face was doing what his father's face did. That controlled surface, that careful management of what came through. Except on a 7-year-old, it was heartbreaking in a way that the adult version wasn't, because you could see the effort it cost him. "Promise," he said. She took the orange crayon from his hands, held it for a second, gave it back. "Right outside the door," she said. "You'll hear my voice the whole time." She pulled the closet door mostly closed and positioned herself in front of it, and she was acutely aware of how small she was, and how completely unarmed she was, and how much it didn't matter, because there was a child behind her, and the math on what she was going to do about that was already finished. They came through the East Wing corridor 6 minutes later. Not Ji-hoon's men. She could tell by the sound. The rhythm was different. The spacing was different. The quality of the movement was the quality of people who were looking for something specific rather than securing a perimeter. 2 of them. She heard them come down the hall, heard one door open and close, then another. Then Minjun's door. She was standing in the middle of the room between the door and the closet when it opened. The 2 men who came through were dressed in dark tactical gear, balaclavas, no identifying marks. They stopped when they saw her. The first one's hand came up. Weapon, a pistol, suppressed like the one from the kitchen, and Amara did not move. She stood in the emergency red light of a 7-year-old's bedroom with her hands at her sides, and she looked at the gun, and she did not move. "Where's the kid?" the first one said. Korean accented English. Deliberate choice. They knew who she was. "Not here," she said. "We can see the room." "Then you can see he's not here." The second one was already moving toward the closet, and she stepped sideways. Not fast, not theatrical, just a step, placing herself in the path. And the first one made a sharp sound, and the weapon came up higher, and she stopped. "Move," he said. "No." The word came out of her with a steadiness that surprised even her. She could feel her pulse in her throat. She could feel the specific weight of exactly what she was doing and what it was likely to cost. She stayed where she was. "Lady," the first one said, with the particular flat impatience of someone whose timeline doesn't include complications. "Move or—" The door behind them disintegrated. That was the word her brain produced afterward, reviewing the sequence. Disintegrated, because the speed at which it happened didn't map onto any normal physics of a door opening. One moment it was there, and then it wasn't, and Ji-hoon came through the space where it had been with two of his men, and the next 8 seconds were not something she watched so much as registered in fragments. Motion, impact, the specific sound of a confrontation that was very one-sided, the suppressed weapon hitting the floor, a second sound, and then silence. Both men were on the floor. Ji-hoon was standing in the middle of the room. He was breathing harder than she'd ever seen him breathe. There was blood on his left hand. Not his, she assessed. The cut patterns were wrong for self-injury. And his jacket was torn at the shoulder, and he was looking at her with an expression so stripped of everything constructed that she almost looked away. He crossed the room in 3 steps. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, her hands, did the inventory. "The closet," she said. He went to the closet door. He opened it. Minjun was in the back corner, in the cedar and something smell with the orange crayon in both hands, and when the door opened, he didn't move for a full second, recalibrating, verifying, and then he launched himself forward, and Ji-hoon caught him and went down to one knee under the impact and held on. Amara stood in the middle of the room and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The next hour was reconstruction. Do-hwan's team had come in 9 total, 4 from the south, 2 from the east wing. 3 held at the north gate by Ji-hoon's forward position. The north approach had been the feint. The south breach had been the real move, time to draw the defensive weight to the wrong side of the estate. It was a good plan. It had very nearly worked. Ji-hoon sat in the security room at 2 in the morning with a fresh shirt. Someone had brought him one, she hadn't seen who, and went through Park's debrief with the systematic attention of a man cataloging the exact dimensions of a failure in order to never repeat it. Amara sat at the far end of the console room and listened and said nothing, because this was not her domain, and she knew it. Minjun was asleep on a cot someone had set up in the security room's anteroom. He'd gone out fast, the way children went out when the adrenaline drained, so completely, without transition, like a switch. The orange crayon was still in his hand. Park finished the debrief, and there was a silence in the room. Ji-hoon looked at the monitors, then he said, "Do-hwan wasn't with them." Park said nothing. "He didn't come himself. He sent the team and stayed back." Ji-hoon's voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger, something colder and more precise than anger. "That means he expected this to fail." Park's expression shifted. "Fraction of a degree." "This was another test," Ji-hoon said. "He's not going to come until he knows exactly what he's walking into. He's mapping us. Every failure gives him information." He paused. "How many operations does it take before the map is complete?" Park said, "At this rate," he stopped. "He knows the south entry now. He knows the north gate response time. He knows the generator position. He knows the east wing layout. He knows everything except one thing," Ji-hoon said. Amara looked up. Ji-hoon was looking at her, not the inventory look. The other one, the one she'd been declining to examine. "He doesn't know why the operations keep failing. He expected casualties tonight. He expected—" He stopped. "He expected me to run," Amara said. "Yes." She thought about that. "He's going to come himself when he figures out why I haven't." "Yes." She looked at the monitor showing Minjun asleep on the cot. The orange crayon. "Okay. You understand what that means." "I understand what that means." Ji-hoon looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Park. "I want everything we have on Do-hwan's personal security detail. Every name, every known movement. I want it by 6. Park left. The other guard cycled out. The room went quiet, just the monitor hum and the low radio traffic of the overnight security rotation. Ji-hoon crossed the room and sat down 2 seats from Amara at the console. He put his hands flat on the surface in front of him and looked at them. The blood on his left hand had dried, and someone had cleaned most of it, but there was still a dark line along the knuckle. "You didn't move," he said. She knew what he meant. The 2 men in Minjun's room. She had stood there with a gun pointed at her and not moved. "No," she said. Why? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about whether there was a version of the answer that was simpler than the real one, and she couldn't find one that wasn't also dishonest. "Because he was behind me," she said. Ji-hoon looked at his hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she'd heard it. Not quiet, but low. The register of something said without the usual structural support of composure. "I have spent 10 years," he said, "making sure there was nothing in this world I couldn't afford to lose. It was the only way to operate. You understand? If there's no pressure point, nobody can use it against you." She was very still. Minjun was the first exception. When Su-yeon died, he stopped at his wife's name, continued. "He became the only exception, the only thing I couldn't insulate, and I thought," he paused again, "I thought one exception was manageable. I knew the risk. I built the walls around it." She waited. "And then," Ji-hoon said, "you dropped a portfolio on my marble floor." Amara looked at the monitor, at Minjun sleeping, at the orange crayon. She said, very carefully, "What are you telling me?" He looked at her directly. "Do-hwan is coming because he's identified 2 pressure points now. He won't stop until he eliminates at least one of them." She understood what he was saying. She understood the full geometry of it. "So you need to eliminate the variable." "No." His voice was flat, immediate. "That's not what I said. Ji-hoon, that is not what I said. They were very close at the console. The emergency lighting had downgraded to normal by now, and the room had a different quality, less dramatic, more actual. She could see the exact lines of exhaustion in his face. She could see the cost of the last 12 hours written in the set of his shoulders. "If I leave," she said, "Do-hwan's map changes. The variable is gone. Minjun is safer." "Minjun," Ji-hoon said, with a controlled precision that took visible effort, "has spoken 114 words in the last 30 days. I counted. The first 40 were to you." He paused. "He asked me this morning if the cake was still okay. Not if he was safe. Not about the men on the grounds. He asked if the cake was okay. Because you made it for him." He stopped again, longer this time. "Do not tell me removing you makes him safer." Amara put her hand over her mouth. Just for a second. Then she put it back in her lap. "Okay," she said. Ji-hoon looked away. Looked at the monitors. The overnight feed showing the south perimeter where the breach had been, where the repair work was already underway in the pre-dawn dark. His men moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had patched things before and would patch them again. "In 48 hours, he said, "I'm going to end this." "How?" "Do-hwan has a financial operation running through 3 shell companies in Busan. I've had eyes on it for 6 weeks. I've been waiting for the right—" He paused. "I've been patient. I've been building the geometry." The edge of something moved through his voice that wasn't quite bitterness. "I should have moved faster." She thought about what Park had said. He's mapping us. Every operation a data point. Every failed breach a measurement. "He's going to move first," she said. "Before you're ready. He knows you're building something." "Probably. So 48 hours might be optimistic." "Yes." The silence in the room had a particular texture now. The texture of 2 people who have looked at the same information and arrived at the same bad conclusion and are sitting with it together. Amara looked at the door to the anteroom where Minjun was sleeping. She thought about the birthday cake under the cloth in the kitchen, 1 day away from its reason for existing. She thought about Do-hwan, a man she'd never met, whose name she'd first heard 10 days ago, who had mapped this household like a military objective, and was now somewhere in the city doing calculations that included her as a variable to be eliminated. She thought about the text message. Tomorrow. Everything. Everyone. Tomorrow was already today. Everything was already in motion. She took a breath. Tell me about the Busan operation, she said. Everything you have. Ji-hoon looked at her. If he moves before you're ready, she said, you need someone who knows the whole picture, not just their piece of it. She met his eyes. Tell me everything. There was a long moment in which he looked at her with something that was past the inventory, past the recalibration, past all the systematic assessments she'd watched him perform for 30 days. Something that had no operational component whatsoever. Then he started talking, and the night moved toward morning around them, and in the anteroom Min-jun slept with an orange crayon in his hand, and outside on the south perimeter Ji-hoon's men worked in the dark, and somewhere in Seoul Baek Do-hwan looked at a map of the Kong estate and drew a circle around the one weakness that remained. And in his hand he held a photograph of a woman from Chicago, and he picked up his phone, and he made a call to someone whose name Ji-hoon had not yet found on any list. The call Do-hwan made lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Ji-hoon's intercept team caught it at 3:47 in the morning, flagged it, and had a partial transcript on Park's desk by 4:15. Park read it standing up. He read it twice. Then he went to the security room, where Ji-hoon and Amara were still at the console, and he put the transcript down on the surface between them without saying anything, which was how Amara understood it was bad before she read a single word. She read it. The name on the other end of the call was Lee Byung-soo. She didn't know the name. She looked at Ji-hoon, and his face had gone somewhere she hadn't seen it go before. Not the controlled flatness, not the stripped-down operational mode. Something below both of those. Something that looked for 3 seconds like a man who has stepped on something in the dark and heard it give way beneath him. Who is Lee Byung-soo? She said. Ji-hoon picked up the transcript, set it back down. My financial director, he said. 15 years. The security room was very quiet. He manages the Busan accounts, Ji-hoon said, the shell companies, the operation I've been building for 6 weeks. He stopped. He built it with me. Amara looked at the transcript, at the 4 minutes and 30 seconds that had just rearranged the geometry of everything. Do-hwan knows about the operation. He's known from the beginning. Ji-hoon's voice was flat in a way that had nothing controlled in it. Flat the way something is flat when all the structure has been removed, and what's left is just the base material. Everything I was building, every piece of the trap. He stood up from the console. Lee told him. All of it. Park said quietly. The 48 hours. Gone. Ji-hoon was already moving toward the door. Get Lee here, now, tonight. Ji-hoon. Park's voice carried something cautionary. Now, Park. Lee Byung-soo arrived at the estate at 5:20 in the morning. Amara watched on the monitor as the car came through the front gate. A black sedan, unremarkable. The kind of car a financial director drove because it was appropriate to his position and not to the actual scale of the money he managed. She watched him get out. He was in his 60s, small-framed, with the careful movements of a man who had spent decades being the least conspicuous person in important rooms. He was wearing a suit at 5 in the morning, which told her something about how he'd received the summons. He knew. She could see it in the way he walked toward the estate entrance. Not hurrying, not slowing, the pace of someone who has already done the internal calculation and arrived at a place of grim resolution. He straightened his jacket before the door opened, the gesture of a man preparing to be seen clearly for the first time. Ji-hoon met him in the study. Amara stayed at the console. She watched the interior feed, the study camera, upper corner angle, and she watched Ji-hoon stand behind his desk and Lee Byung-soo stand in front of it, and she watched the conversation happen in the soundless pantomime of the security feed, and she didn't need the audio. Lee spoke first, longer than she expected. Ji-hoon stood completely still for all of it, hands at his sides, face unreadable on the camera's resolution. When Lee finished, Ji-hoon said something brief. Lee responded. Then Ji-hoon said something that made Lee close his eyes, and when he opened them again, he looked like a man who had set something down that he'd been carrying for a very long time. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. Park came to the console room at 5:40 and said, Do-hwan is moving. Our source in his organization, the one Lee didn't know about, says he's mobilizing a full operation, not a probe, not a test. A pause. He's coming to finish it. Tonight. Amara looked at the study feed. Ji-hoon was alone now, standing at his desk with both hands flat on the surface, head down. How many? She said. 30 minimum, possibly more. Park's voice was even, which cost him something she could hear. He's bringing everyone. It's a consolidation move. Take out Ji-hoon completely, absorb the territory, present a fait accompli to the remaining syndicates. And Lee gave him everything he needs to do it. The defensive architecture, the personnel positions, the communication frequencies. Park stopped. The location of the safe room. She looked at him. The room Min-jun was in during the first breach, Park said. Do-hwan knows where it is and how to disable the lock from the outside. The specific cold that moved through her then was different from fear. Fear had heat in it. The adrenaline burn, the body's preparation for flight or fight. This was something else. Something that came from understanding a situation completely and finding it completely unacceptable and deciding very clearly that unacceptable was not the same as inevitable. She stood up. Wake Min-jun. Move him somewhere Do-hwan doesn't know about. She looked at Park. There has to be somewhere. Park looked at her steadily. There is one place? Then move him there. Right now. Park turned and went to do it. She went to the study. Ji-hoon looked up when she came through the door. His hands were still on the desk. The expression on his face when he saw her did the thing it had been doing more frequently, the thing she was going to need to address in the future when there was a future to address things in. It shifted. Some of the weight of the last hour moved slightly at her arrival, and he let it move, which she understood was not something he did automatically. Park told me, she said. I know. How many people knew about the Busan operation? 4. Now 3. He straightened up, rolled his neck once, the motion of a man reassembling himself from the ground up. Lee has been feeding information to Do-hwan for 2 years. The operation wasn't a trap. It was a gift. I was building Do-hwan a complete picture of my financial infrastructure and handing it to him in pieces. She looked at him. Why did Lee do it? A pause. His son has debt. The kind that doesn't stay financial for long. His voice was without judgment, just information. Do-hwan found it and applied pressure 18 months ago. Lee held out for 6 months, and then he didn't. He told you this. He told me everything, just now. Ji-hoon looked at the window, where the pre-dawn dark was beginning to thin at the edges. He came here tonight to confess, not because I summoned him. He called Park before Park called him. A pause. He said he couldn't. He said when Park told him about the East Wing breach, about Min-jun being in the room. He stopped. He has grandchildren. The room was quiet. Does that change what happens to him? Amara said. Ji-hoon looked at her. No. She nodded. She hadn't expected it to. She wasn't sure she'd have respected it if it had. Tonight, she said. Do-hwan is coming tonight. We have... She checked the clock on the wall. 14 hours, maybe less if he moves early. 12, Ji-hoon said. He'll come after dark. He always comes after dark. It's operational preference. He's documented for it going back 8 years. So we have until nightfall. Yes. She put her hands on the desk. Mirroring him, both of them braced on the surface, the full architectural drawings of a problem spread between them in the air. The Busan operation is burned, she said. Yes. Everything you built on it is burned. Yes. So you need something Do-hwan doesn't know exists. She looked at him. What does Lee not know about? Ji-hoon looked at her for a moment. Then the edge of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Not in this room at this hour with this much weight in the air, but related to one. I thought you were the nanny, he said. I'm a nanny who has been in 2 armed incursions in 4 days and has read every intelligence brief you've left on the kitchen table. She held his gaze. What does Lee not know about? What Lee didn't know about was a man named Choi Dae-won, Ji-hoon told her in 20 minutes, standing at the window as Seoul came up gray and cold through the glass. Choi was Do-hwan's logistics coordinator, the man who moved the Black Tiger Syndicate's physical assets, personnel, and contraband across 3 provinces without leaving a traceable paper trail. He was good at it. He had been doing it for 11 years. He had also, for the last 4 months, been quietly transferring information to Ji-hoon's organization through a channel that Lee Byung-soo had never been told existed, because Ji-hoon had built that channel himself, told no one, and kept it in his head rather than in any system that had a financial director's access. Choi knew where Do-hwan was staging tonight's operation. He knew the personnel count, the equipment load, the precise timing, and most critically, he knew the 3 things Do-hwan considered non-negotiable personal security requirements that, if satisfied, made him feel unreachable. The 3 conditions he always established before a major operation that he believed guaranteed his safety. Ji-hoon had been waiting for the right moment to use this. The right moment was now. "What are the 3 conditions?" Amara said. Ji-hoon told her. She listened and her brain processed it the way it processed everything. Systematically, looking for the internal logic, the load-bearing points, the place where the structure was weakest. When he finished, she said, "The 3rd one. That's the one." He looked at her. "If the 3rd condition fails," she said, "he doesn't move. He restages. It buys time. Or it alerts him that Choi is compromised. Only if the failure looks intentional." She straightened up from the desk. "Does it have to look intentional?" A silence. "No," Ji-hoon said slowly. "It doesn't." "Then that's the move." She looked at him. "Buy time. Not a lot. Enough to reposition." He was looking at her with the full attention he usually reserved for intelligence documents, and the faces of men he was about to make decisions about. It was a lot of attention. She was accustomed to it by now in the way you became accustomed to a strong light. You learned to function in it without looking directly. "You understand this doesn't end it," he said, "even if tonight fails for him. He comes back." "I know. This ends when Do-hwan is finished, not inconvenienced. Finished. I know that too." She looked at the window, at Seoul coming up gray in the early light. "So we inconvenience him tonight and finish him tomorrow." Ji-hoon picked up his phone. Min-jun's birthday happened at 9 in the morning in a room 3 levels below the main estate. It was not the room Park had told Do-hwan about. It was not in the security system Lee Byung-soo had accessed. It was a room that existed in the original architectural plans of the estate under a designation that translated, roughly, as secondary storage, and that Ji-hoon had converted 11 years ago into something else entirely and told exactly no one about, which was the kind of information that kept a man alive in his profession. It had a table, it had chairs, it had, brought down by Amara at 7:30 in the morning, through the kitchen and the service stairs and 2 locked doors, 1 chocolate birthday cake with 3 slightly uneven layers and Min-jun's name in frosting that had set overnight and was exactly right. Min-jun looked at the cake for a long time. Then he looked at his father, then at Amara. His face was doing the thing it had been doing more and more in the last week, the thing where the control he'd been maintaining gave way in patches, like ice in spring, revealing underneath it the actual face of a 7-year-old boy who had been waiting a very long time for something he couldn't have named. "It's really mine," he said. "Every layer," Amara said. He looked at his father again. Ji-hoon was sitting on the other side of the table in yesterday's shirt, lines of exhaustion etched into his face, and he was looking at his son with an expression that had nothing managed in it, nothing strategic, nothing that bore any relationship to the man who ran an organized crime empire and was currently orchestrating the downfall of a rival syndicate. He looked like a father at his son's birthday. "Happy birthday," Ji-hoon said. His voice came out rougher than intended. He cleared it, said it again. "Happy birthday, Min-jun." Min-jun picked up his fork with both hands. Amara cut the cake. They ate birthday cake at 9 in the morning in a secret room below a mansion that was being prepared for war, and it was the best chocolate cake Amara had ever made, and she knew it, and she was glad. The day moved with the particular quality of time that preceded violence. Stretched in some places, compressed in others, the normal rhythm of hours replaced by something that felt like a held breath. Ji-hoon was on communications for most of it, repositioning personnel, establishing new frequencies that Lee had never known, making contact with Choi Dae-won through a channel so narrow and so carefully constructed that even Park hadn't known about it until this morning. Rebuilding the architecture of the evening's defense from the foundation up, using only the materials Do-hwan hadn't been handed, Amara stayed with Min Jun. They drew. They talked about whales and about the Han River and about Chicago in winter, and she taught him a card game her grandmother had taught her that had rules. She was approximately 60% sure she was remembering correctly, and he beat her at it twice, which she chose to believe was his skill rather than her uncertainty about the rules. At 3 in the afternoon, Ji-hoon came to where they were. The same room. Min Jun asleep by then on the narrow cot, the orange crayon on the table beside him, and he sat down across from her without speaking. He put a radio on the table. He looked at his son sleeping. Choi confirmed the staging location, he said quietly. Industrial complex in Mapo. Do-hwan is planning to move at 10, 32 personnel. Did the third condition fail? Not yet. It will. He looked at the radio. I have 30 men positioned, 8 interior, the rest on a perimeter that Do-hwan's reconnaissance won't find because it doesn't exist in any plan he's been given. He paused. It's enough, if the intelligence holds. And if it doesn't? He looked at her. Then it won't be enough. She thought about 32 men mobilizing in an industrial complex in Mapo. She thought about Lee Byung-soo and 15 years and a son's debt and 6 months of holding out. She thought about Seo Ah on a phone call, telling Do-hwan about the frosting on the cake. What do you need me to do tonight? She said. Stay with Min Jun, in this room. Don't open the door until you hear from me or Park directly. He held up the radio. This frequency, this code word. He told her the word. Anything else, you don't open the door. Okay? Amara. She looked up. His voice had shifted into the register she'd heard at 2 in the morning at the console. Low, unstructured, the register of things said without the usual scaffolding. When this is done, he said, when tonight is finished and Do-hwan is... He stopped, looked at Min Jun. I want to talk to you. We talk every day. Not like this. He looked back at her. Not like this. She held his gaze for a moment that had a specific weight to it, the weight of everything in the last 30 days, the flower on the ceiling and the whale pancake and the kitchen floor and the orange crayon and 2 in the morning at a console and a small boy's voice saying, it's not a shoe, it's a whale. And she said, okay. He stood up. He looked at Min Jun one more time, sleeping, peaceful, birthday sugared, and unaware, one hand loose around the orange crayon. He looked at him for 5 seconds without the control layer, without the management, just looking at his son in a secret room under his house while the city outside moved toward night. Then he picked up his jacket and went to war. Night came at 7. By 8, the perimeter reports started coming through the radio in steady intervals. Park's voice, clipped and precise, calling positions and confirmations in the code system Ji-hoon had built that morning from scratch. Amara sat in the chair beside Min Jun's cot, with the radio in her hand, and listened and translated what she could, and filed what she couldn't, and breathed. Min Jun woke at 8:30. He looked at her, at the radio. Is it happening? He said. Yes. He sat up. He held the crayon. Is my dad out there? Yes? He was quiet for a moment, then, he'll be okay. She looked at him. At the certainty in his face, not the performed certainty of someone trying to be brave, but the actual kind. The kind built from 30 days of watching his father be exactly what he said he was going to be. Yeah, she said, he will. At 9:40, the radio went to a frequency of updates that came faster, and she sat forward in the chair, and her hand tightened on the casing, and Min Jun pressed against her side. And she put her arm around him automatically, the way she always did, the body knowing before the brain. At 9:53, Park's voice came through clipped and hard. North breach, contact, there, static. Voices overlapping, then, Southgate holding, east side, more static. A sound she couldn't identify. Then nothing for 40 seconds that were the longest 40 seconds she'd experienced since a pediatric resuscitation 3 years ago in the clinic that she'd never fully stopped carrying. Then gunfire, unmistakable, transmitted through the radio in a cascade of flat, hard sounds that Min Jun heard and went completely still against her, and she held on. At 10:07, Ji-hoon's voice came through the radio, not Park. Ji-hoon directly on the frequency he'd told her, and he said 2 words, the code word, then her name. and the tension in her body released so suddenly it was almost painful. "Status," she said into the radio. "Contained." His voice was rough, uneven, carrying something physical in it. "North breach repelled. Do Hwan's team is... Most of them are secured. Park is managing the east side. Are you... I'm functional." A pause. The specific pause of a man deciding what level of honesty to operate at. "I took a hit. Left side, it's not... Ji-hoon. It's not critical. I need you to stay in that room. Tell me where you are." Amara. "Tell me where you are or I'm opening this door." A silence. Then, main courtyard, south entrance. She looked at Min Jun. He was watching her face the way he watched things when the information mattered. "Your dad's in the courtyard," she said. "He's okay. He's got people with him. I need to check on him." She held his gaze. "You stay in this room. You don't open this door. You have the radio." "I know," Min Jun said, and then very quietly, with the particular precision of a child choosing his words carefully, "Bring him back." She handed him the radio. She went out the door. The estate looked like the aftermath of a decision. That was the only way she could describe it later. Not a battlefield, not a crime scene, but the physical residue of a very large decision that had been made very quickly by a very large number of people. She moved through it fast, through the service corridor and up the stairs and through the main floor hallway, stepping around things and past people who were moving with the focused purpose of men in the final stages of securing a situation. And nobody stopped her because she had been in this house for 30 days, and every person in it knew her face. The south courtyard was lit by the exterior security lights, cold white, and there were men she recognized moving in patterns she was starting to understand. And there, near the south entrance wall, was Ji-hoon. He was sitting against the wall. Standing next to him was a guard with a trauma kit open on the ground, working on Ji-hoon's left side. She could see the blood from 15 meters away. She closed the 15 meters. He looked up when she got there. Something moved across his face. "I told you to stay. You're going to need stitches." She crouched beside him. She looked at what the guard was working on. Left side, below the ribs, a wound that was exactly what Ji-hoon had said, and not worse. Not critical, the blood flow already controlled, the kind of injury that hurt considerably, and healed completely. "How many?" "Probably 12, the guard said. He glanced at Amara. She nodded at him, and he kept working. Ji-hoon looked at her face. His was the least constructed she'd ever seen it. Pain does that, strips the management away, gets down to the materials. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the courtyard was loud with the aftermath around them, and they were in a small quiet at the center of it. "Do Hwan," she said, "in custody." His voice was rough. "Park has him. He came himself. I was right about that. He came because he believed the intelligence was complete. He believed he had the full picture. He didn't. No." The edge of something moved through his eyes. "He didn't have you." She looked at the injury, at the guard's hands working. She looked at the wall behind Ji-hoon and at the cold white light and at Seoul beyond the perimeter, enormous and indifferent and lit up against the night. "You said you wanted to talk," she said, "when it was done. It's not done yet. It's done enough." She looked at him directly. "Say what you need to say." He looked at her for a long moment. The guard finished the pressure bandage and stepped back. The noise of the courtyard moved around them. Ji-hoon's hand, the one that wasn't braced against the wound, moved to the ground beside him. Not reaching, just moving, the way a person's hand moved when the body was trying to do something the mind hadn't fully authorized yet. "I don't have language for it," he said. "I've been trying to find the language for 3 weeks. I don't..." He stopped. "I've spent 10 years making sure I couldn't be reached. And you walked in and dropped a portfolio on my floor and my son picked up a crayon and I..." He stopped again. She waited. "I don't know how to do this," Ji-hoon said. And it came out stripped of everything. No architecture, no control, just the bare fact of it from a man who had built his entire existence on knowing exactly how to do every necessary thing. "I don't know how to..." "Ji-hoon," he looked at her. "I know," she said. "I don't either." The courtyard was loud. Somewhere in the estate's interior, a door was being secured. Someone called Park's name across the grounds. The city hummed beyond the walls with its enormous, unconcerned life. Ji-hoon's hand moved on the ground beside him. She put her hand next to it, not taking it, just there, adjacent. His fingers found hers. She looked at the south wall where 30 minutes ago men had come through with the intention of ending this household. And she looked at his hand and she thought, Min-jun is in a room below this building holding an orange crayon waiting to hear his father's voice. And she pressed Ji-hoon's fingers once and stood up. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes." "Then get up. Your son is waiting." He looked at her from the ground. She put out her hand. He took it and she pulled and he came up and they stood in the cold light of the south courtyard while the last of the evening's decisions were being catalogued around them. And Baekdo Hwan sat in zip ties in a room somewhere in the estate's interior, not yet knowing that the woman he'd been trying to eliminate for 30 days was the exact reason every operation had failed. And somewhere below their feet a 7-year-old boy was holding a radio and an orange crayon and waiting. Min-jun heard them before he saw them. Footsteps on the stairs. 2 sets, one heavier and uneven, one steady. And he was off the cot and at the door before they reached the bottom landing. He had the radio in one hand and the orange crayon in the other, and he stood in front of the door with the particular stillness of a child who has spent 2 years learning that the space between hearing something and knowing what it means is the most dangerous space there is. Then his father's voice, on the other side of the door, low and rough. "Min-jun, it's us." The boy unlocked the door. Ji-hoon was upright, which was the first thing Amara had insisted on when they'd left the courtyard. "You walk in on your own feet. He needs to see you standing." He was pale and the left side of his shirt was dark, but the guard's bandage was holding and his face. When the door opened and his son was there, 6 inches from the threshold, looking up at him with those eyes that were too old and too young simultaneously, his face did something that Amara looked away from. Because it belonged to them. Min-jun didn't say anything. He stepped forward and put both arms around his father's waist, careful on the left side in a way that meant he'd already assessed where the injury was, because he was Ji-hoon's son and he noticed things. He pressed his face against his father's chest and held on. Ji-hoon's hand came down on the back of his son's head. He closed his eyes. Amara stood in the corridor and looked at the wall. She gave them 2 minutes. Then she said, "He needs a hospital." Ji-hoon opened his eyes. A state physician is adequate for field dressing and inadequate for what comes next. He needs imaging. He needs proper sutures. He needs someone to confirm there's no internal involvement. She said it in the flat clinical voice she'd developed at the pediatric clinic for conversations where emotion was a distraction. "Park can arrange a secure transfer. 30 minutes. Ji-hoon looked at her over Min-jun's head. "That's not a discussion," she said. He almost smiled. It looked like it hurt, which she filed as additional evidence for the hospital argument. "Park," he said. Park, who had materialized in the corridor with the reliability of a man who existed in doorways during important moments, said, "Already arranged. No." They took him at 11:15. Amara stayed at the estate with Min-jun. This was the arrangement, and it was the correct arrangement, and she stood in the main entrance and watched the vehicle go down the hill toward the city with its lights off, and felt the particular quality of silence that descended on a place after the thing it had been bracing for was finally done. Min-jun stood beside her. "He'll be back by morning," she said. "I know." He looked at the gate, at the city lights below. Amara. "Yeah." The cake was really good. She laughed. It came out of her before she could manage it. Genuine, low, the kind of laugh that surprised the person doing it. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Yeah," she said. It was. The estate in the hours after was not quiet in the way she'd expected. There was work. The systematic, unglamorous work of aftermath. Documenting, securing, cleaning. Park moved through it all with the organized efficiency of a man who had managed consequences before and knew the taxonomy of them. Amara moved through her portion of it, checking in with the rotation guards, making sure the household staff who'd been sheltering in the West Wing were accounted for, doing the things that needed doing because they needed doing, and she was there. At 1 a.m, she sat in the kitchen and made tea. She was sitting at the table with her hands around the cup when Park came in. He stood in the doorway the way he always stood, present without imposing, waiting to be acknowledged. Do Juan, she said. In transit to a secure location. Park crossed to the counter, poured water for himself. The relevant authorities have been contacted. The evidence package is comprehensive. He won't resurface in any operational capacity. Lee Byung-soo. Park was quiet for a moment. Also handled. She looked at the table. Is he alive? Yes. Another pause. Ji-hoon's instruction. She thought about that. About a financial director in his 60s with a son whose debt had cost 15 years of loyalty. About 6 months of holding out before the weight of it became something else. She thought about what Ji-hoon had said. He came here tonight to confess. Not because I summoned him. So, she said. That one, Park said carefully, is more complicated. She looked up. She made a call. She passed information. The legal exposure is real, but difficult to establish in a way that... He stopped, found a different door. Ji-hoon's instruction there is also specific. She will not be charged. She will also never be in proximity to this household again. The mechanism for ensuring the second part is not the legal system. Amara thought about Seoa, in the sitting room with her coat still on. I built everything myself. I did not get here by being soft. She thought about what it cost a person to build themselves from nothing into something, and then watch someone walk in with a spilled portfolio and an orange crayon and take the thing you'd decided was yours. She didn't forgive it. She understood it, which was different and less comfortable. Okay, she said. Park drank his water, set the glass down. He looked at her with the flat, assessing look that had recalibrated its assessment approximately 6 times in the last 30 days. You should sleep, he said. I know. Miss Brooks. She looked up. Park Sung-jin, who had worked for Kang Ji-hoon for 9 years and had seen things that would rearrange the structure of most people's interior lives, stood in the kitchen doorway and said, Thank you. She looked at him for a moment. She nodded once. He left. She finished the tea. She went upstairs. She slept. Ji-hoon came back at 7:15 in the morning. She heard the gate. She was already in the kitchen. The pre-dawn habit had survived everything. Apparently, it was going to survive this too. And she heard the vehicle and the footsteps, and then he was in the kitchen doorway. He looked better. Worse in a visible, catalogable way. The pallor, the careful way he held his left side, the lines in his face, that 11 stitches and a sleepless night, and the full weight of an empire in transition had deepened. But better in the way of someone who has passed through the worst part of something and is standing on the other side of it. She pointed at the table. He sat. She made eggs. She put the plate down in front of him and poured coffee and sat across from him, and he looked at the food and then at her, and she said, Eat, and he ate. They were quiet for a while. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. The professional scale of it, the expensive surfaces, the morning light coming through the window over the garden. The garden wall looked different to her now. She wasn't sure it would ever look the way it had the first week. The imaging was clear, he said. No internal involvement. The physician confirmed Park's field assessment. Good. I have a meeting with the consortium at noon. The transition of Do Hwan's territories is going to require... He stopped. Several months of careful management. Okay. After which, he stopped again. She waited. Ji-hoon put his fork down. He looked at his hands on the table, then at her. I've been building an exit, he said, from the operational side for 3 years, quietly. He said it the way he said important things. Direct, undecorated. The legitimate holdings are large enough. The infrastructure exists. I've been waiting for the right moment to make the transition complete. And now Do Hwan is the last significant obstacle that was going to follow me into whatever came next. He looked at the table. It's not immediate. It's not clean. These things don't get clean quickly, but the direction is... He stopped. I'm telling you the direction. She looked at him. At the careful way he was holding himself, the cost of the night written in every line of him, the fact that he was here at 7:15 in the morning in her kitchen telling her the direction. Why are you telling me the direction? She said. He looked at her directly. You know why. She held his gaze. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was catching the early light, the grass still dark with dew, the wall at the far end just a wall. I'm from Chicago, she said. I took a childcare exchange program to Seoul because I wanted to try something different. I have a lease on a studio in Hongdae that's paid through December. My professional credentials are in pediatric development, not... She gestured at the kitchen, the estate, the accumulated weight of his world. Any of this? I know. I'm clumsy. I'm aware. I break things. I set off alarms. I cost you a pair of Italian shoes. One shoe, he said. You got flour on one shoe. The other was fine. She looked at him. The edge of his mouth moved. It hurt him. She could see it, the left side pulling at the stitches. And he moved it anyway, and she felt something give way in her chest that she recognized belatedly as the last resistance of a woman who had been building a very reasonable case for an exit that she did not actually want to take. Minjun laughs now, Ji-hoon said. Quieter. He uses full sentences. He asked me last night, in the car, on the way to the hospital. He asked me if you were going to stay. He paused. He didn't ask about Do Hwan. He didn't ask about the men on the grounds. He asked if you were going to stay. What did you tell him? I told him I was going to ask you. She looked at the table, at her hands. She thought about the clinic in Chicago, about the apartment in Hongdae, about a portfolio on a marble floor and 60 crayons rolling in every direction and a small boy in a gray sweater picking up an orange one. I was going to leave in December, she said, when the exchange program ended. Go back to Chicago, find a position, do the thing I trained to do. I know. That was the plan. I know that too. Plans change, she said. And then, before he could say anything, before the moment could be made into something larger than it was or smaller than it was. Minjun needs a speech pathologist, a good one, someone who specializes in post-traumatic selective mutism. I know 2 in Seoul who are excellent. I want to bring one of them in starting next month. Ji-hoon looked at her. He's making huge progress, she said. He's going to keep making it. But he needs the support properly structured. I can coordinate that, but I'm not a replacement for specialized care. I want to do this right. Okay, Ji-hoon said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard precisely before. Something warm and rough simultaneously, like wood grain. And I want a real contract, not whatever the last 11 nannies had, a real one, with terms I've reviewed. I'll review it myself. Yes, Ji-hoon said. You will. She looked at him across the kitchen table. He looked back at her. The morning light was doing what morning light did in that kitchen, filling it with something ordinary and clear, making the expensive surfaces look like what they were, just surfaces, just the place where the day started. The Italian shoes, she said, already replaced. I'll probably get those ones too eventually. Probably. He picked up his fork again, looked at the eggs. Amara. Yeah. Thank you. He said it the way he said the things that cost him, directly, without surrounding it with other words. For Minjun, for the last 30 days, He stopped. For not leaving. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the woman she'd been walking up those front steps 5 weeks ago, standing at the bottom for 2 minutes, running through her checklist, deciding she wasn't going to let the weight of the place press her into the ground. She thought about what it cost a person to believe they belonged somewhere before the evidence confirmed it. I almost didn't come in, she said. I stood at the bottom of the steps for 2 minutes. I know. I watched on the camera. She stared at him. You watched me stand outside. I watched everyone. Security protocol. You watched me stand there and talk myself into it. You didn't look like someone who needed to talk themselves into it, he said. You looked like someone who had already decided and was giving themselves 30 seconds before they acted. She thought about that. That's a generous read, she said. It's what I saw. Yes. Minjun came down at 8. He came in and looked at his father sitting at the kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, and he made the assessment that children made. Complete, fast, filed. Then he looked at Amara. Then at the stove where she'd pushed the eggs aside and started pancakes without fully deciding to. Are you making whales? He said. I'm attempting whales, she said. No guarantees on the outcome. He climbed into the chair next to his father. He looked at Ji-hoon's left side, at the way he was holding himself. He reached over and put his small hand on his father's arm, the gesture of someone who didn't have the language for what they were doing and didn't need it. Ji-hoon looked at his son's hand on his arm. He put his hand over it. Amara turned back to the stove. The pancake in the pan was taking a shape that bore only a passing relationship to any whale she'd ever seen depicted, and she felt something move through her, something that had been moving in pieces over 5 weeks and was now assembling into its full shape. And she blinked it back because she had a pancake to manage. "That's not a whale," Minjun said from the table. He was watching the pan. "It could be a whale. It's a boot. A whale who's wearing a boot." "Whales don't wear boots." "How do you know?" A pause. "Because they don't have feet." "They have fins," she said. "A boot could go on a fin." Silence from the table. She glanced back. Minjun was looking at his father. Ji-hoon was looking at the ceiling with an expression of a man employing very deliberate restraint. "That doesn't make sense," Minjun said. "Make me a better whale, then." She slid the spatula across the pan. "Come tell me what I'm doing wrong." The chair scraped. He came to stand beside her at the stove. He looked at the batter. He looked at the pan. He reached up and took the spoon from the counter and looked at her for permission, and she nodded, and he poured. His whale was immediately, obviously, correctly, whale-shaped. She stared at it. "How did you—" "You put too much at the front," he said seriously. "The head needs to be smaller, and the tail has to curve." He pointed at the appropriate anatomical regions of his pancake whale. "I've been making these wrong for a month." "I know. They were still good, though." She looked at him. He was looking at the pan with the focused attention of a child who had found something he was better at than an adult and was handling it graciously. She thought, 114 words. I was there for the first 2. "Minjun," she said. He looked up. "I'm staying," she said. "If that's okay with you." He looked at her for a moment. The old stillness, the one that was about assessment rather than absence, moved across his face. Then it cleared. "Okay," he said. He turned back to the whale pancake. She turned back to the stove. Behind them at the table, Ji-hoon said nothing. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was fully lit now. The wall at the far end just a wall. The city below the hill visible in the clear autumn morning. Enormous and intricate and entirely indifferent, going about its business without reference to what had been decided in this kitchen. The months that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a world in the process of becoming something different from what it had been. De Huan's case moved through channels that had nothing to do with public courts and everything to do with the agreements that governed the city's actual structure. He was not a free man. He was not going to become one. The precise architecture of his containment was something Park managed with the systematic thoroughness he brought to everything, and Ji-hoon was informed of the relevant developments, and the irrelevant ones were not brought to the kitchen table. Lee Byung-soo was gone from the organization. He was alive. He was in Busan with his son, who had been quietly extracted from the debt situation through a mechanism that bore Ji-hoon's fingerprints and his name on nothing. This was not forgiveness. It was a man who had built his life on cold calculations, making a warmer one and not explaining why. And Amara knew why without being told. And she didn't say anything about it because there was nothing to say that Ji-hoon hadn't already said to himself. Seoa's name stopped appearing in certain contexts. She continued appearing in others. Fashion weeks, campaigns, the surfaces of the public world she'd built herself from nothing, because she had built it and it was hers and nobody had taken it. Amara thought about her sometimes. She thought about the sitting room and the coat that hadn't come off, and the specific pitch of a woman who had confused armor for identity for so long, the two had become indistinguishable. She didn't think about it with satisfaction. She thought about it the way you thought about things that were true and complicated and not fully resolved, which meant she thought about it occasionally rather than constantly, and eventually occasionally became rarely. The speech pathologist was a woman named Dr. Han, who wore glasses she was always taking off and putting back on, and who had, in Amara's professional assessment, exactly the right combination of technical rigor and genuine warmth that Minjun's particular situation required. Minjun met her with the assessment stillness. By the 3rd session, he was asking her questions. By the 6th, he was correcting her pronunciation of an English word she'd used, which Dr. Han received with appropriate delight. His vocabulary expanded the way held water expands when a container finally has room, in all directions, quickly, filling available space. He had opinions about food, about the guard's dog who remained technically prohibited from the East Wing and was in practice a permanent East Wing resident, about the best angle from which to view the Han River at different times of day, about the structural inadequacies of Amara's pancake technique. He expressed these opinions at length and with conviction. Ji-hoon listened to all of them with the careful attention of a man in receipt of something he had feared he might never get again. And if he was sometimes slightly undone by the sheer volume of words coming from a child who had been silent for 2 years, nobody mentioned it. Abamas. Ji-hoon's transition took the shape of what it actually was. Long, incremental, and without clear demarcation between what it had been and what it was becoming. He was not a man who transformed overnight. He was a man who made decisions over time and then lived in the direction of them. The legitimate holdings expanded. The operational side contracted. Not all at once, not without negotiation and friction and the particular complexity of disentangling a decade of interlocking arrangements, but in the direction he'd named at the kitchen table on the morning after. And Amara understood that naming a direction to another person was its own form of commitment for a man who had kept his own counsel for 10 years. There were still meetings she wasn't told about, still calls that happened with the door closed, still moments when she came into a room and something shifted in the atmosphere in a way that told her she'd arrived at the edge of a territory that was not hers to enter. She didn't resent it. The work of knowing someone was different from the fantasy of knowing someone completely, and she'd spent enough time with children who'd been failed by fantasy to be committed in her own life to what was real. What was real was the kitchen at 6 in the morning. What was real was the security feed he'd stopped watching every evening. She knew he'd stopped because Park had mentioned it with the neutrality of someone noting a fact that required no editorial. And what was real was Sunday afternoons in the garden with Min-jun and the dog, and occasionally Ji-hoon when the week's work allowed it, all three of them in the grass that was too cold now for sitting, but that they sat in anyway because the view of the Han River was perfect from that angle, and Min-jun had determined this empirically, and the data was not in dispute. The evening he proposed, it was summer. Seoul in summer was a different animal from Seoul in autumn. Wetter, louder, the air thick enough to taste, the city reflecting heat back up from every surface. The Lantern Festival on the Han had been Min-jun's idea originally, something Dr. Han had mentioned in a session as a cognitive emotional exercise, and it had become a plan, and plans had become the three of them, plus 2 plainclothes guards, and the kind of evening that happens when the security protocols have been running long enough that they become invisible. The lanterns went up over the river in hundreds. Min-jun ran ahead on the bank with the focused joy of a child who has recently discovered that running somewhere is better than standing still, and the 2 plainclothes guards tracked him with the practiced invisibility of people who had been doing exactly this for months. And Ji-hoon and Amara walked behind at the pace of people who had been somewhere long enough to stop rushing through it. The river was lit up the way Min-jun had described. The lights on it, gold and moving, the lanterns above it adding their own light. The city behind them doing what cities did at night. It smelled like water and something alive underneath, which was what she'd told him a lake could smell like. And she thought about that with the particular pleasure of a connection landing. Ji-hoon stopped walking. She took 2 more steps and turned. He was standing behind her with his hands in his pockets, not performing anything, not constructing anything, just standing there in the lantern light looking at her with an expression she knew now, had learned over months the way you learned a language, had come to be able to read without translation. "We're going to lose Min-jun in about 30 seconds, she said. Park's watching him. Park is always watching him. That's not the same as us watching him. Amara. She stopped. He took his hands out of his pockets. He looked at her the way he had across the kitchen table, on the morning after the worst night, the way he had in the south courtyard with blood on his shirt, the way he had in the receiving room when his son picked up an orange crayon, and somewhere below the surface of his controlled existence, something began to shift that was still shifting now, 8 months later, with no indication that it intended to stop. He said, "I know I'm not the easiest version of this." "You're not," she agreed. "I know the world you're choosing into is—" He paused. "Not simple. Nothing about the last 8 months has been simple." "No?" He was quiet for a moment. The lanterns went up and over the river. "I know what I'm asking." Do you? I'm asking you to stay. Not through December. Not through whatever comes next after that. He said it directly, without ornament, the way he said everything that mattered. I'm asking you to stay. She looked at him. She looked at the river. She thought about the steps at the bottom of the hill and 2 minutes of composing herself, and a portfolio that had decided to redistribute itself across Italian marble and 60 crayons and a large iced coffee. She thought about a boy picking up an orange crayon. She thought about whale pancakes and flour on the ceiling and 2 in the morning at a security console and a code word on a radio in a room 3 levels underground. And she thought about all of it as the thing it actually was. Not an accumulation of incidents, but the shape of something. A shape she recognized because she'd been inside it long enough to feel its dimensions. Minjun said he'd want me to say yes, she said. Ji-hoon's expression shifted. You talked to him. He brought it up. He's 7. He's perceptive. And he has opinions about everything, which is your fault because you listened to them. The edge of Ji-hoon's mouth moved. It moved more easily now than it had in October. The muscles had been getting practice. She crossed the 2 steps between them. She looked up at him in the lantern light over the Han River that his wife had brought his son to see at night. The lights on the water, and she thought, this is what it costs, and this is what it gives, and those 2 things are not separate. Yes, she said. He didn't move for a moment. Then his hand came up to her face. Careful. Specific. And he held it there with the attentiveness of a man who had spent 2 years building walls around everything and was now, slowly, learning that the alternative to walls was not exposure, but something else entirely. Something that required more from him, not less. Something that asked him to be present in a way that walls had made unnecessary. He was learning. She was learning. That was what it was. Somewhere ahead of them, on the riverbank, Minjun's voice rose above the noise of the crowd, specific and delighted. The voice of a child who had found something worth reporting on. And it carried back to them over the water and the lanterns and the summer heat of Seoul, clear and bright and real. Ji-hoon's hand was warm against her face. She put her hand over it. The lanterns kept going up.